Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Mr. Bell. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. My name is Jack and I've been a park ranger for the Cherokee National Forest for 8 years. When I got the transfer notice to the Great Smoky Mountains Backcountry Station, I thought it was a promotion. The pay was better, the cabin was mine alone, and I'd be managing one of the most remote sections of the park that straddles the Tennessee-North Carolina border. What they didn't tell me in the briefing was why the last 3 rangers had requested immediate transfers within 6 months of starting. I'm Cherokee on my mother's side. Grew up hearing the old stories from my grandmother before she passed. Stories about the Nunnehi, the immortal spirit people who lived in the mountains. Tales of the raven mocker, a terrible creature that fed on the dying. She'd tell these stories matter-of-factly, the same way she'd give me instructions for finding wild ginseng or identifying poison ivy. To her, these things were as real as the mountains themselves. I'd mostly written it off as folklore, the kind of cultural mythology every people develops to explain the unexplainable. Then I spent my first night in the backcountry station. The cabin sat in a clearing about 12 miles from the nearest maintained trail, accessible only by a rough service road that washed out completely every spring. Solar panels on the roof, a propane generator for backup, and a satellite phone that worked maybe 60% of the time. The rangers who briefed me kept the meeting short, and I noticed they wouldn't quite meet my eyes when I asked about wildlife encounters. You'll see black bears, obviously. Ranger Matthews told me, shuffling through papers. Elk have been reintroduced to the area. Wild boar, though they're mostly nocturnal. Keep your food stored properly. What about the big cats? I asked. The briefing mentioned possible mountain lion sightings. Matthews and the other ranger, a woman named Sarah Chen, exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. There haven't been confirmed mountain lions in these mountains for decades, Sarah said carefully. But hikers report them sometimes. Large canines too, bigger than any coyote should be. The official position is that people are mistaking bears or dogs. And the unofficial position? Another long pause. Matthews cleared his throat. Keep your sidearm on you at all times, even inside the cabin, especially at night. That should have been my first warning. I moved into the cabin on a Tuesday in late September. The autumn colors were just starting to turn the mountains into layers of gold and crimson. I spent the first day settling in, checking the boundaries of my patrol area, and familiarizing myself with the trail systems. The forest felt old here. Older than the tourist areas closer to the main park. There were sections where the trees grew so thick that afternoon felt like twilight, where the silence was so complete it seemed to have weight. By evening, I'd covered maybe a quarter of my patrol route and headed back to the cabin. The sun was setting behind the western ridges, turning the sky purple and orange. I made dinner, checked in via satellite phone with the main station, and settled in to read by lamplight. The generator hummed quietly in the background. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of the forest at night. Insects, the occasional hoot of an owl, wind moving through the trees. Around 11, the sound stopped. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that sudden silence means something. Prey animals freeze when predators are near. The forest holds its breath. I set down my book and listened, my hand instinctively moving to the Glock on my hip. At first, there was nothing. Then I heard it, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. But the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too measured. Something bipedal, but the gait suggested something much larger than a human. I moved to the window and eased back the curtain. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows across the clearing. I didn't see anything at first. Then movement caught my eye near the tree line, maybe 40 yards from the cabin. It stood upright, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair. The proportions were wrong for a bear standing on its hind legs. The arms were too long, the shoulders too broad, and bears don't stand motionless, watching for minutes at a time. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. There are things in the mountains that were here before us, Jack. Things that will be here after we're gone. The old people knew to respect them, to leave them alone. The thing in the tree line tilted its head, and I swear it was looking directly at my window, directly at me, even though I was inside, in the dark, with the curtain barely cracked. It knew I was watching. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, and I heard the footsteps again, heavy and deliberate, fading into the distance. The forest sounds gradually returned. Insects first, then night birds, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair with my pistol in my lap and the satellite phone next to me, debating whether to call it in. And report what exactly? That I saw something big and hairy in the woods? They'd think I was jumping at shadows on my first night. When dawn finally came, I went outside to look for tracks. The ground near the tree line was soft from recent rain, and I found them easily. Footprints, vaguely human-shaped but enormous, at least 18 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The stride length between prints was nearly 6 feet, 5 toes clearly visible. Not bear tracks, not human tracks. Something else. I took photographs, measurements, made notes in my daily log. Then I followed the tracks into the forest, my hand on my weapon, trying to convince myself I was dealing with something known to biology, something that had a rational explanation. The tracks led deep into the forest, toward the highest ridges of my patrol area. After about 2 miles, they simply stopped at a rocky outcropping, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. I stood there in the morning light, breathing hard from the climb, and felt the weight of the mountains pressing down. This was just the first night. I had at least 6 months out here alone, 12 miles from the nearest help. My grandmother had been right. There were things in these mountains, old things, that didn't want to be found, and I was living in their territory now. 3 weeks passed before the next incident. I'd fallen into a routine: patrol during the day, maintain trails, check on the handful of backcountry campers who obtained permits for the remote areas. At night, I'd secure the cabin, check and recheck the locks, and try to sleep with one ear open. I'd seen the tracks twice more, always near the cabin, always circling. Whatever it was kept its distance but wanted me to know it was there. The isolation was getting to me. The satellite phone worked for official check-ins, but personal calls were prohibited except for emergencies. I hadn't seen another human being in 12 days when I encountered the group of hikers on the northern trail. There were 4 of them. College-aged, with expensive gear and the kind of enthusiasm that told me they'd never done serious backcountry hiking before. They were at least 6 miles off their intended route, heading deeper into the wilderness instead of toward their permitted campsite. "You folks are pretty far off trail," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "Your permit has you at Cooper Ridge campsite tonight." The group's leader, a young man named Derek, looked at his GPS unit with confusion. "That can't be right. We've been following the trail markers." "There aren't any trail markers this far out," I told him. "This is unmaintained wilderness." "What markers did you see?" His girlfriend Ashley pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. My blood went cold. Stacked rocks, small cairns, leading off into the dense forest. But I'd never built those markers, and they weren't on any official trail. "Did you build these?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No. We thought they were trail markers. We've been following them for the last 2 miles. In Cherokee tradition, stacked rocks can be grave markers or warnings. Something was deliberately leading these hikers away from safety, deeper into the territory I'd been patrolling. The territory where something large and bipedal walked at night. "You need to come with me," I said. "Now, we're heading back to my station, and you're staying there tonight." They started to protest, but something in my tone made them comply. As we hiked back, I kept checking behind us, scanning the forest. The afternoon light was fading fast, and we were still 3 miles from the cabin. That's when we heard the first howl. It came from the ridge above us, echoing through the valley. Not a wolf howl, though it started that way. It began as a deep, resonant note that climbed in pitch until it became almost human, almost like a scream, before dropping back down into a growl that I felt in my chest. The hikers froze. "What the hell was that?" Derek whispered. "Keep moving," I said, unholstering my pistol. "Don't run, but we need to move faster." A second howl answered from our left, maybe half a mile away. Then a third from behind us. They were pacing us, coordinating. Whatever was out there, there was more than one, and they were moving with intelligence and purpose. "Are those wolves?" Ashley asked, her voice tight with fear. "There are no wolves in the Smokies," I said, which was true. Red wolves had been reintroduced to North Carolina years ago, but not in these mountains, and they'd never sounded like that anyway. The howls continued, always from different directions, always maintaining the same distance. We covered the last 2 miles in record time, and I'd never been so relieved to see the cabin. I got everyone inside, locked the doors and closed all the shutters. "What's going on?" Derek demanded. "What are those things?" I was asking myself the same question. The howls didn't match any animal I knew. My grandmother had told me stories about the Wampus cat, a creature from Cherokee legend that was supposed to haunt these mountains. Part woman, part cougar, cursed to wander forever. But that was folklore, just stories. Wasn't it? Night fell, and the howls grew closer. Through the gaps in the shutters, I caught glimpses of movement in the moonlight. large shapes, moving on four legs, circling the cabin. But when they stood still, I could swear they stood upright. "I'm calling this in," I said, reaching for the satellite phone. But when I tried to make the connection, I got nothing but static. The backup channel, same thing. We were cut off. Around midnight, something hit the side of the cabin hard enough to shake the walls. The hikers screamed. I moved to the window, pistol ready, and risked a look outside. A massive canine shape stood in the clearing, easily the size of a small horse. Its fur was dark, almost black, and its eyes reflected the moonlight with an amber glow. But the proportions were wrong. The front legs too long, the head too large, the jaw too pronounced. As I watched, it rose up on its hind legs and looked directly at the window where I stood. It was nearly 7 feet tall when upright, its front paws more like hands, with elongated digits that could almost grip. The snout was longer than any wolf's, filled with teeth that caught the moonlight. And those eyes, those amber eyes, held an intelligence that froze my blood. "Dogman," I whispered, barely believing what I was saying. Another creature from folklore, reported across America for decades but always dismissed as misidentification or hoax. Standing in my clearing, real, the creature dropped back to all fours and released another of those terrible howls. 3 more emerged from the tree line, surrounding the cabin. They moved with coordination, testing the perimeter, checking for weaknesses, pack hunters. Intelligent. Terrifying. We stayed in that cabin until dawn, listening to them circle, scratch at the doors, test the shutters. When the first light of morning came, the sound stopped. I waited an hour before I risked opening the door. The clearing was empty, but the ground was covered in tracks, canine but too large, with claw marks that suggested something that could grip and climb, and on the door scratches gouged deep into the wood, almost 4 feet off the ground. The satellite phone worked again, and I called in an emergency evacuation for the hikers. They were gone by noon, escorted out by a team from the main station. I filed a report about aggressive wildlife, kept it vague, didn't mention what I'd actually seen, but I knew the truth now. My grandmother's stories weren't just folklore, they were warnings. And I was living in the middle of territory claimed by creatures that weren't supposed to exist. October brought early snow to the high peaks, and with it a new problem. Hikers reported a man following them on the trails, always staying just out of sight, matching their pace for miles before vanishing into the forest. The descriptions varied, but everyone agreed on certain details. Tall, thin, moving with an odd gait, wearing what looked like buckskin or leather clothing. I encountered him myself on a routine patrol of the eastern boundary. The trail crossed a high meadow, one of the few places where you could see for miles in every direction. I was halfway across when I spotted him standing at the far tree line. Maybe 200 yards away, he was watching me. Even from that distance, something felt wrong. The proportions weren't quite right. The way he held himself, the angle of the limbs. I raised my binoculars for a closer look and immediately wished I hadn't. What I'd taken for buckskin clothing was skin, but it was wrong. Patchy, different colors, stitched together in places. The face was covered by what looked like a deer hide, complete with antlers, but I could see human eyes peering through holes cut in the mask. Or were they human eyes? They seemed too large, too reflective. I'd heard about skinwalkers from my grandmother, though she'd spoken of them in whispers. They were part of Navajo tradition primarily, but similar legends existed in Cherokee stories. Witches who wore the skins of animals to gain their powers, to move between human and animal form. Evil beings that corrupted everything they touched. The figure raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or a warning. Then it turned and walked into the forest with a gait that shifted mid-step from bipedal to quadrupedal and back again, as if it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. I reported the encounter as a possible trespasser in illegal clothing, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it was connected to everything else that had been happening. The mountains were waking up, or maybe I was just finally seeing what had always been here. That night I heard scratching on the roof. Not the random scrabbling of squirrels or raccoons, but deliberate, methodical scratching, like something was trying to get in through the shingles. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam upward. Nothing. But the scratching continued, always just ahead of where my light pointed. I walked around the cabin, following the sound, and realized with growing horror that whatever was up there was pacing me, staying directly above my position as I moved. "I know what you are," I called out in Cherokee, using the language my grandmother had taught me. "This is my territory. Leave now." The scratching stopped. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then I heard a voice from the roof, speaking in Cherokee, in my grandmother's voice. "Jackie, come up here with me. I want to show you something." My grandmother had been dead for 5 years, and she'd never called me Jackie. I backed toward the door, keeping my light trained on the roofline. For just a moment I saw it, a humanoid shape crouched on the peak of the roof. Too long, too thin, covered in that patchwork of animal skins. Its head turned completely around to look at me, far beyond what any human neck could manage. "That's not my name," I said, reaching for the door handle. "And you're not my grandmother." The thing on the roof laughed, and the sound was like rocks grinding together like wind through dead trees. "Your grandmother knew us, Cherokee. She left offerings, showed respect. You should do the same. Get off my roof. This is not your land, Ranger. You are a guest here. We are family. We have always been here." I went back inside and locked the door, knowing how futile it was. These things, whatever they were, weren't bound by locks or walls. They operated on different rules, older rules. Rules I didn't understand. The scratching continued until dawn. In the morning I found the roof covered in tracks. Human handprints, coyote paw prints, deer hooves, all layered over each other in an impossible mixture. And arranged in a circle on the ground in front of the cabin, I found a collection of items that made my skin crawl. Small animal bones, arranged in patterns. Strips of fur and feathers. And in the center a carved wooden figure that looked exactly like me. A miniature ranger complete with uniform and hat. It was old work, weathered, as if it had been carved years ago and left waiting for me to arrive. My grandmother had told me that skinwalkers could curse people, could steal their shadows and trap their spirits. Looking at that carved figure, I believed it. Something out here had been waiting for me, preparing for me. I gathered everything up with a stick, careful not to touch any of it with my bare hands, and burned it all in a metal barrel. The smoke was thick and black, and it smelled like rot and disease. As it burned, I heard laughter in the distance, echoing from multiple directions. They were playing with me. This was all a game to them. That afternoon, I hiked to the highest point in my territory, a rocky outcrop where my grandmother had once taken me as a child. She'd shown me how to leave offerings there, small gifts of tobacco and cornmeal, tokens of respect for the spirits of the mountains. I'd thought it was just tradition, cultural practice with no real significance. Now I understood it was protection, a way of maintaining balance, of acknowledging the presence of things humans had tried to forget. I left tobacco and cornmeal, and I spoke in Cherokee, asking for safe passage, for respect, for protection. The words felt awkward after years of disuse, but they came back to me, muscle memory from childhood. The wind died down as I spoke. The forest grew quiet, and for just a moment I felt something change, a subtle shift in the pressure of the air, like a massive predator deciding not to pounce. When I hiked back to the cabin that evening, I felt watched but not threatened. The presence in the forest was still there, still aware of me, but it had stepped back, giving me space. My grandmother had been right about everything, and I was beginning to understand that surviving out here meant more than knowing first aid and navigation. It meant respecting forces that modern education said didn't exist. Forces that my ancestors had known and feared and learned to live alongside. November brought the first real snow, and with it a disturbing change in behavior. All the creatures I'd encountered, the things that had been watching from the shadows, started converging on my territory. The tracks multiplied, overlapping, creating a palimpsest of impossible footprints around the cabin and along every trail I maintained. Something was calling them together. I found evidence of kills in the forest, deer and wild boar taken down by different predators, often within sight of each other. Natural competitors sharing territory, which shouldn't happen. The laws of nature seemed to be suspended in my section of the mountains. Then the hikers started disappearing. The first one was a solo backpacker named Michael Torres, experienced, equipped with GPS and satellite messenger. His last check-in put him on the Northern Ridge Trail, moving toward my station. He never arrived. The search and rescue team found his camp 2 days later, tent still standing, gear untouched, sleeping bag laid out as if he'd planned to return. No signs of struggle, no blood, no body, just tracks all around the campsite. Dozens of different tracks, surrounding the tent in concentric circles. Human footprints mixed with bear, canine, deer, and others I couldn't identify. The second disappearance happened 4 days later. A couple from Ohio experienced hikers vanished between 2 established checkpoints on a well-marked trail. We found their packs hanging from a tree branch 15 feet off the ground, contents untouched, but no trace of the hikers themselves. I was part of the search team for both incidents. We covered hundreds of square miles, used thermal imaging, brought in tracking dogs. The dogs refused to follow any trails, whining and pulling back toward the vehicles. Whatever scent they picked up terrified them. On the 3rd day of the second search, I separated from the main group to check a remote area near the highest peaks. The snow was deep up there, pristine and unmarked. But as I crested a ridge, I saw it. A massive clearing I'd never noticed before, though I'd patrolled this area dozens of times. The trees formed a perfect circle around open ground, and in that circle, I saw them all. The creatures from my grandmother's stories gathered together in the fading afternoon light. The big one, the Bigfoot, stood on the eastern side, at least 9 feet tall, its dark fur covered in frost. Near it, the pack of dogmen sat on their haunches, vapor rising from their breath in the cold air. The skinwalker crouched on a boulder, wrapped in its patchwork of stolen skins, its head moving in jerky, bird-like motions. But there were others. Things I'd never seen before. A massive cat with 6 legs, its fur rippling like water. Something that looked like a bear but stood upright with arms that ended in hands, not paws. A pale, thin humanoid with no face, just smooth skin where features should be, standing motionless among the trees, and in the center of the clearing on a flat stone lay the missing hikers. All 3 of them, unconscious but alive, arranged in a triangle formation. I don't remember deciding to enter the clearing. I found myself walking forward, my hand on my weapon but not drawing it, moving with a calmness I didn't feel. Every predatory eye turned toward me, but nothing moved to stop me. "I'm taking them," I said in Cherokee, then repeated it in English. "These people are under my protection." The skinwalker laughed its grinding, terrible laugh. "You think you have power here, Ranger? You think your offerings and prayers grant you authority?" "I think my grandmother taught me respect," I said. "I think I've honored the old ways, and I think taking these people breaks the balance." The Bigfoot made a deep sound in its chest, somewhere between a growl and speech. The dogman shifted, looking between me and the other creatures. The skinwalker tilted its covered head, studying me with those 2 large eyes. "Your grandmother was wise," a voice said, though I couldn't tell which creature spoke. The sound seemed to come from the clearing itself, from the trees, from the stones. She understood boundaries, respect, the old agreements. "Then honor those agreements," I said. "Let them go." "They wandered into our places," the voice said. "They ignored the warnings, the signs. They are ours by right." I thought of the cairns, the stacked stones that had led the first group of hikers astray. These creatures had been deliberately luring people into the deep wilderness, claiming them somehow. But why? And why now? "What's changed?" I asked. "You've been here for generations, living in the shadows. Why reveal yourselves now? Why take people?" Silence fell over the clearing. The creatures looked at each other, some kind of wordless communication passing between them. Finally, the voice spoke again. "The world forgets us. The forests shrink. The mountains are carved into trails and roads and buildings. We fade when we are not believed in, not respected, not feared. We gather now to remind the humans that these places are still ours, still wild, still dangerous. We take because we must be acknowledged." I understood then. They were fighting for survival in their own way, trying to maintain their existence in a world that had no place for them. But that didn't make what they were doing right. "There are other ways," I said. "I acknowledge you, I respect you. Let me tell your stories. Remind people that these mountains are sacred, dangerous, alive. Let me be the bridge between your world and mine." The skinwalker moved closer, its patchwork form shifting and changing. "And if we release these humans, if we trust you to keep the agreements, will you stay? Will you remain here, the keeper of thresholds, the one who remembers?" I thought of my grandmother, of the offering she'd left, the respect she'd shown. She'd been doing this all along, maintaining the balance, keeping the peace between the old world and the new. And now they were asking me to take her place. "I'll stay," I said, "as long as you need me to." The creatures withdrew, melting back into the forest, vanishing into the shadows and snow. Within moments, I was alone in the clearing with the 3 unconscious hikers. I called it in, guided the rescue team to the location, and stayed silent about what I'd seen. The official report listed the hikers as disoriented by hypothermia, suffering from exposure and mild hallucinations. They remembered nothing of their time in the clearing, nothing of the creatures that had taken them. Maybe that was mercy. But I remembered, and I knew my life had changed forever. Winter settled fully over the mountains, and I settled into my new role. The creatures still came, still watched, still made themselves known to me, but they didn't threaten. We had an understanding now, an agreement that echoed the old ways my grandmother had honored. I learned their patterns, their territories. The Bigfoot stayed in the highest elevations, moving through the ancient forests where humans rarely ventured. The dogmen ranged across the middle slopes, pack hunters that avoided confrontation when respected but were merciless to those who trespassed foolishly. The skinwalker was the most dangerous, the most unpredictable, bound by rules I didn't fully understand but feared to break. I started keeping detailed notes, documenting everything I saw, creating a record that would serve whoever came after me, because I knew now that this position wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a responsibility that had been passed down through generations of people who stood between the mundane world and the mysterious one. In December, a team of people arrived at my station unannounced. They weren't wearing Park Service uniforms, and their credentials identified them as working for a federal agency I'd never heard of. They knew about the disappearances, about my reports, and they wanted answers. We've been tracking anomalies in this area for years, the team leader, a man who introduced himself only as Fisher, told me. Unexplained phenomena, missing persons, sightings of cryptids. This forest has the highest concentration of reports in the entire eastern United States. What have you seen? I could have told them everything. Part of me wanted to share the burden of knowledge, to have someone else confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But I remembered the agreement I'd made in the clearing, remembered the creatures who'd trusted me to be the bridge, not the traitor. I've seen bears, I said carefully. Large black bears that people sometimes mistake for something else in poor lighting. I've seen timber wolves, though officially they're not supposed to be here. I've tracked what might be a mountain lion, though I've never gotten a clear visual. The wilderness plays tricks on people, especially when they're tired or scared. Fisher studied me for a long moment. You're protecting something. I'm protecting these mountains, I said, which was true, and the people who visit them. Sometimes that means acknowledging that there are things we don't understand, things we're not meant to understand. They stayed for 3 days, searching, documenting, scanning the forest with equipment I didn't recognize. They found nothing conclusive, nothing that couldn't be explained away. When they left, Fisher handed me a card with a phone number. If you change your mind, he said, if you decide you want to tell us what's really happening here, call that number. We can protect you. I threw the card into the fire that night. The creatures were watching from the tree line. I could feel their presence, and I wanted them to see my choice. I was their keeper now, their guardian and their warden both. Christmas came and went. The main station tried to get me to come down for the holiday celebration, but I declined. I couldn't leave, not anymore. My territory needed me here, maintaining the balance, ensuring that the boundaries were respected on both sides. On New Year's Eve, I hiked up to the high rocky outcrop where I'd left offerings before. The night was crystal clear, cold enough that my breath froze in my beard, and the stars were brilliant overhead. I brought tobacco and cornmeal, honey and dried meat, small tokens of respect for the spirits of the mountain. As I laid them out, speaking the words in Cherokee that my grandmother had taught me, they came. All of them, emerging from the forest in silence, forming a circle around the outcrop. The Bigfoot, massive and ancient. The dogmen, pack hunters with intelligence in their amber eyes. The skinwalker, terrible and powerful in its stolen skins. And others, creatures I was still learning about, still trying to understand. The old year ends, I said, speaking to them directly for the first time since the clearing. The new year begins. I stand here as keeper of thresholds, guardian of boundaries. I honor you and the wild places you protect. I ask for continued peace between our worlds. The Bigfoot made its deep rumbling sound almost like speech. The dogmen howled, their voices carrying across the mountains. The skinwalker raised its hands in a gesture that might have been blessing or warning or both. And I felt it then, the weight of what I'd accepted, the responsibility I'd taken on. I was no longer just a park ranger. I was a keeper of old agreements, a bridge between worlds, a guardian of secrets that most people would never believe. My grandmother had prepared me for this, even if I hadn't understood it at the time. Every story she'd told, every offering she'd taught me to make, every word of Cherokee she'd insisted I learn, it had all been training for this role. The creatures withdrew as silently as they'd come, melting back into the forest. I stood alone on the outcrop, watching the stars, feeling the presence of the mountains around me. In the distance, I heard the first howl of the new year, echoing across the ridges, a reminder that the wild places were still alive, still dangerous, still sacred. Down in the valleys, people would be celebrating, counting down to midnight, never knowing what lurked in the high mountains above them, never knowing that someone stood watch, maintaining the balance, keeping the agreements. I thought about the rangers who'd come before me, the ones who'd requested transfers after just a few months. They hadn't been able to accept what they'd seen, hadn't been able to live with the truth. I understood that now. It takes a particular kind of person to stand in the space between worlds, to acknowledge that reality is stranger and more dangerous than we're taught to believe. As I hiked back down to the cabin, I saw fresh tracks in the snow following my trail. Not threatening, just watching, just making sure I made it home safely. The creatures were keeping their end of the bargain too, in their own way. I reached the cabin as midnight struck, marked only by the chiming of my watch. A new year, a new beginning, the same ancient truths. I built up the fire, made coffee, and sat down to write in my journal, documenting everything I'd learned, creating a record for whoever might come after me someday. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and dark, filled with secrets that most people would never know. And I stood guard over those secrets, keeper of thresholds, guardian of the old ways, a park ranger who'd learned that his grandmother's stories weren't folklore at all. They were warnings. They were truths. They were the price of living in places where the wild things still held power, where the boundaries between possible and impossible grew thin, where the old gods and monsters still walked in the darkness. I was home. The transfer paperwork sat on my dashboard like a death sentence, the words Appalachian Regional Ranger Station, Carter County, Kentucky, printed in sterile black ink. I'd requested this post 6 months ago, back when the idea of isolation seemed romantic, when I thought the worst thing I'd encounter would be lost hikers or illegal hunters. That was before I knew what these mountains really held. My name is Leo, and I've been with the National Park Service for 8 years. Started in Arizona, moved to Colorado, then Montana. Always chasing something. Maybe peace, maybe purpose, maybe just distance from a life that fell apart in slow motion. The divorce, the drinking, the demotion that came with both. This transfer was supposed to be my reset button, my chance to prove I could still do the job without someone looking over my shoulder. The gravel road leading to the station wound through forests so dense the afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy. Eastern Kentucky in late October painted itself in rust and amber, but there was something else here too. A heaviness that settled in my chest the deeper I drove into these ancient mountains. The locals called this area the Dark Hollers, though no official map used that name. My predecessor, a ranger named Nathaniel, had mentioned it once during our brief phone conversation, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Just be careful out there after dark," he'd said. "And if you hear something that sounds like a woman screaming in the woods, don't go looking. It's probably not a woman." I'd laughed it off as typical rookie hazing, the kind of tall tales veterans told to spook the new guy. But Nathaniel hadn't laughed with me. He'd just gone quiet for a long moment before saying, "Good luck, Leo. You're going to need it." The ranger station materialized from the mist like something out of a Gothic novel. A 2-story log structure with a sagging porch and windows that reflected the darkening sky like dead eyes. A newer satellite dish and radio antenna seemed absurdly modern against the building's frontier aesthetic. My living quarters would be upstairs, while the office and equipment storage occupied the ground floor. The nearest town, a fading coal community called Blackwater Creek, was 45 minutes away on roads that became impassable in winter. I was alone out here, completely, utterly alone. The first 3 days passed uneventfully, filled with the mundane tasks of settling in, organizing equipment, familiarizing myself with the trail system, updating old maintenance logs that Nathaniel had neglected. The forest maintained its oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional crow or the rustle of wind through dying leaves. No birdsong in the mornings, no deer sightings during my patrols. Just silence, thick and watching. On the 4th night, I found the journal. I'd been searching the storage room for replacement batteries when my flashlight caught the edge of something wedged behind a filing cabinet. The leather-bound book came free with some effort, its pages yellow and brittle, filled with entries dating back decades. Different handwriting styles marked the changing of rangers over the years, but the content remained disturbingly consistent. August 3, 1987. Ranger Glenn reporting. Found 3 deer carcasses near Dead Man's Ridge, all stripped of flesh but no sign of predator activity. Bones arranged in a pattern. Something is watching the station at night. I can feel its eyes. October 12, 1994. Ranger Maurice. The screaming in the hollers is getting worse. It sounds almost human, but no human throat could sustain those notes. Wilson from town says the old-timers call it the Screaming Walker. Says it's been in these mountains since before the Cherokee, before the first settlers. Says it's older than memory. June 7, 2008, Ranger Craig. I saw it tonight. God help me, I saw it through my bedroom window. Tall, so impossibly tall, with eyes that reflected my flashlight like an animal's. It was standing in the tree line, just beyond the clearing, perfectly still. When I turned away to grab my rifle, it was gone. But I could hear something circling the cabin, something heavy moving through the underbrush with a gait that wasn't quite right. I'm requesting a transfer. The entries went on. Hundreds of pages spanning nearly 40 years. Each one documenting the same phenomena with escalating dread. Unexplained sounds. Missing time. The sensation of being watched. Cattle mutilations in the valley below. And always, always, references to something tall and wrong moving through the trees. Nathaniel's entries filled the final pages, his handwriting growing more erratic with each entry. September 15, it comes closer every night. Last night it was at the tree line. Tonight I found tracks 20 feet from the porch. Elongated humanoid prints, nearly 18 inches long. Whatever made them was standing upright, walking on two legs. The tracks lead deeper into the mountains, toward the old logging camp at Fletcher's Gorge. September 23. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see it standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin with those terrible eyes. I've started sleeping with all the lights on, but I don't think it cares about light. I don't think it cares about anything human at all. September 29, final entry. I'm leaving tomorrow, transfer approved or not. Last night it came onto the porch. I heard the boards creaking under its weight, heard something breathing just outside my bedroom window, deep rattling breaths that fogged the glass. In the morning I found handprints on the window, if you could call them that. 4 fingers and a thumb, but wrong proportions, too long, too thin. Whatever is in these mountains, it's not an animal, it's something else. Something that's been here far longer than we have, and it doesn't want us here. To whoever reads this, get out while you still can. That was dated 3 days before I arrived. I set the journal down with shaking hands, trying to rationalize what I'd read. Shared delusion among isolated rangers. Local folklore bleeding into perception. Carbon monoxide poisoning from the old propane heater. Anything but the obvious conclusion staring back at me from those yellowed pages. But that night, as I lay in bed with every light in the cabin blazing, I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate, moving with an unnatural rhythm. 3 steps, then a pause, then 3 more steps. Back and forth across the weathered planks, as if something was pacing just beyond my door. I held my breath, my service weapon clutched in both hands, and listened to whatever was out there test the limits of my door, my sanity, my understanding of what was possible in this world. The footsteps stopped at my bedroom window. Through the thin curtain, I could see a shadow tall, so impossibly tall that its head reached the top of the 7-foot window. And then came the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life, breathing deep and wet and wrong, carrying with it the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and feral. In the morning, I found the tracks Nathaniel had described, but I also found something he hadn't mentioned. Claw marks on the cabin's log walls, gouged deep into the wood, running in vertical lines from ground level to nearly 8 feet high. Whatever was in these mountains, it was real, and it had marked me as its next target. The rain came hard and mean that first week of November, turning the unpaved roads into rivers of mud and the forest trails into treacherous gullies. I'd spent 3 sleepless nights since finding those claw marks, each one a test of endurance as I waited for the return of whatever had visited my cabin. But the creature I'd stopped pretending it was anything else hadn't come back. Not yet. The radio crackled to life around 10 in the morning, cutting through the steady drum of rain on the metal roof. Ranger Station, this is Blackwater Creek Sheriff's Department. You copy? I grabbed the receiver, grateful for any human contact. This is Ranger Leo. I copy. Go ahead. Leo, this is Deputy Hudson. We've got a situation up on the old logging road near Fletcher's Gorge. Group of hikers reported finding something unsettling. Sheriff wants a ranger present before we head up there. Can you meet us at the trailhead in an hour? Fletcher's Gorge. The name from Nathaniel's journal entries sent ice through my veins. What kind of unsettling are we talking about? Static filled the pause before Hudson responded. They said they found a camp, but the tent was shredded from the outside, and there's blood. A lot of blood. No body, though. The trailhead sat at the end of a deteriorating dirt road that the county had stopped maintaining years ago. 2 sheriff's vehicles were already there when I arrived, along with a mud-splattered Jeep Cherokee that I assumed belonged to the hikers. Deputy Hudson turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s with the careful eyes of someone who'd seen too much in these mountains. His partner, a younger woman named Deputy Claire, was taking statements from 3 thoroughly shaken college students. "Appreciate you coming out," Hudson said as I approached. "This is the kind of thing that tends to bring out the crazies, people talking about Bigfoot and whatnot. Having official Park Service presence helps keep things rational. I didn't mention the journal, or the tracks, or the thing that had breathed against my window 3 nights ago. Instead, I asked, what exactly did they find? The oldest of the college students, a kid named Jackson, who couldn't have been more than 20, overheard and spoke up. "Man, we didn't sign up for this. We were just doing the Daniel Boone Trail circuit, you know? Supposed to be an easy weekend hike." His hands shook as he pulled out his phone. "We found this about 2 miles up the gorge trail." The photos on his screen showed carnage. A high-end camping tent had been torn open, the technical fabric ripped in long parallel gashes that suggested claws. The sleeping bag inside was shredded, covered in dark stains that could only be blood. Camp equipment lay scattered across a wide radius, a portable stove 20 feet up in a tree, a backpack torn apart with its contents strewn like confetti, a hanging bear bag pulled down and eviscerated. "There's more," said one of Jackson's companions, a thin girl named Lily, whose face had gone ash pale. "We found tracks, leading away from the camp, heading deeper into the gorge." "What kind of tracks?" Hudson asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Big," Jackson said. "Like way too big. Almost 2 feet long, shaped like a human footprint, but wrong. The stride length was insane too, like whatever made them was either running or just massive." Hudson and I exchanged a look. He gestured for me to follow him away from the students, lowering his voice once we were out of earshot. "This is the third incident in 2 months. First was a hunter who disappeared off the Rockhouse Ridge Trail. Never found the body, just his rifle bent in half and his tree stand torn down. Second was a family camping near Cooper's Falls, who swore something circled their tent all night, something that walked on 2 legs and made sounds they couldn't describe. And now this." "What do the locals say?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. Hudson's jaw tightened. "The old-timers? They say it's the Screaming Walker. Legend goes back to the Cherokee who used to live in these hollers. They called it something that translates to the Tall Hunger. Said it came down from the high peaks when food was scarce, that it had walked these mountains since the world was young. White settlers encountered it too. There are records from the 1800s about something in the mountains that took livestock and occasionally people. Always left the same signs. Massive tracks, claw marks on trees, and that sound."
"What sound?"
"Like a woman screaming in absolute terror, but sustained for minutes at a time. Echoes through the hollers so you can't tell where it's coming from. Every ranger who's been stationed at your cabin for more than a season has heard it." He studied my face carefully. "You've heard it too, haven't you?" I thought about lying, maintaining some professional skepticism. But the weight of those journal entries, the evidence scattered across Jackson's phone screen, and the memory of those breathing sounds outside my window made denial seem pointless. Not the screaming, but something was at my cabin earlier this week. Something that left tracks. Hudson nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then you need to be careful, Leo, really careful. Because here's what the old-timers won't tell you directly. What gets whispered about in the diners and church basements. Once it notices you, once you're marked, it doesn't stop. It watches, it waits, and eventually, it comes." We hiked up to the destroyed campsite with Claire and a deputy named Matthew who'd arrived as backup. The rain had lessened to a cold drizzle, and mist clung to the gorge walls like grasping fingers. The sight was worse in person, the violence of the attack evident in every torn surface and scattered piece of equipment. Whatever had done this possessed terrible strength and no concern for human presence. Claire found the tracks Lily had mentioned preserved in a muddy section of trail beneath an overhanging rock face. I knelt beside them, feeling my stomach drop as I studied the impressions. Elongated humanoid foot structure, 5 toes, but the proportions were wrong. The foot was too narrow, the toes too long, the arch too pronounced. The stride length suggested something at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and the depth of the impressions indicated immense weight. "These are fresh," Matthew said, his voice tight. "Can't be more than 12 hours old." Hudson pulled out a measuring tape documenting the prints with grim efficiency. 18 inches from heel to longest toe. Jesus, whatever made these was huge. I followed the track line with my eyes, watching them disappear into the dense forest climbing the gorge wall. Somewhere up there, in the mist-shrouded peaks of the Appalachians, something inhuman was watching. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, that same sensation I'd experienced at the cabin, but amplified, more focused. "We need to close this section of the park," I said. "These trails aren't safe." Hudson nodded. "I'll talk to the county supervisor. But Leo, you should know we've closed sections before. Doesn't seem to matter. The incidents just move to wherever is still open. It's like this thing has a territory that covers the whole mountain range, and it goes wherever it wants." As we headed back down the trail, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. High up on the gorge wall, barely visible through the mist and dying foliage, I saw movement, something tall and dark, standing perfectly still among the trees, watching our group descend. When I blinked, it was gone. That night, back at the cabin with every door locked and every light blazing, I opened Nathaniel's journal to the entries about Fletcher's Gorge. One passage jumped out. The gorge is its hunting ground. Steep walls, limited escape routes, sound echoes that confuse and disorient prey. Smart, methodical. It drives victims toward the cliffs or toward the parts of the trail that are unstable. It's patient. It understands terrain better than any human hunter. and it's learning our patterns, when we patrol, where we camp, how we respond to incidents. I checked my service weapon, made sure my radio was charged, and settled in for another sleepless night. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest preternaturally quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just silence pressing against the windows like something alive. Around midnight, my radio hissed to life. No voice, just static, but underneath it I could hear something else, distant and distorted, rising and falling in pitch. Screaming. A woman screams, echoing through the hollers, carried on radio waves like a ghost signal from somewhere deep in the mountains. The sound lasted for 3 minutes before cutting off abruptly, leaving only static and the hammering of my own heart. The county supervisor closed Fletcher's Gorge to hikers, but Hudson was right, it didn't matter. 3 days after we found the destroyed campsite, a hunter named Grayson went missing from the Pinnacle Ridge Trail, 5 miles east of the gorge. His son found his truck at the trailhead, engine still running, driver's door wide open. Inside the cab, Grayson's rifle sat fully loaded, and his cell phone showed a half-typed text message, "Something is following M." They found his body 2 days later, or what remained of it. I was part of the search party, along with Hudson, a state trooper named Dylan, and a tracking specialist from Virginia named Isaac, who'd worked missing persons cases throughout Appalachia. We found Grayson at the bottom of a ravine, his body broken in ways that suggested a fall from significant height. But the wounds told a different story. "These lacerations," Isaac said, studying the corpse with a clinical detachment I envied. 4 parallel cuts, deep enough to score bone. And look at the pattern. They're consistent across the torso, the limbs. Whatever attacked him had claws or talons, struck repeatedly, systematically. Could it be a bear? The state trooper asked, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Isaac shook his head. "Bear claws don't create this pattern. These are almost surgical in their precision. And bears don't typically throw their victims off cliffs." "Throw?" I asked, feeling my skin prickle. "Look at the trajectory." Isaac pointed up the ravine wall. He went over from that outcropping, about 40 feet up, but his last defensive wounds, he gestured to Grayson's shredded forearms, suggest he was fighting something at ground level. Something picked him up and threw him, or dragged him to the edge and pushed him over. We climbed to the outcropping where Isaac believed Grayson had gone over. The scene there was haunting. Drag marks in the dirt leading to the cliff edge, a section of disturbed earth where something had clearly struggled, and most damning of all, those tracks. The same elongated humanoid footprints I'd seen at Fletcher's Gorge, but this time they were everywhere, circling the area like the creature had been pacing, stalking, taking its time. "It hurted him," Hudson said quietly, "like a predator cornering prey. Drove him up here where there was nowhere left to run." I noticed something else, deep gouges in a nearby oak tree, claw marks running vertically down the trunk from a height of at least 10 feet, and caught in the bark barely visible were strands of dark hair, coarse, thick hair that didn't match any animal I'd encountered in my years as a ranger. Isaac collected samples with tweezers, sealing them in evidence bags. "I'll get these to the state lab, but I'll tell you right now what they're going to say. Probably black bear, maybe a contaminated sample. They're not going to conclude what we're all thinking." "And what are we thinking?" Dylan asked, though his pale face suggested he already knew. "That something in these mountains is actively hunting people," I said. "Something large, intelligent, and patient. Something that understands human behavior well enough to ambush and corner us." Back at the ranger station that evening, I spread out everything I'd collected: photos from both attack sites, measurements of the tracks, samples of the claw marks, copies of the historical records Hudson had pulled from the county archives. The pattern was undeniable. Every 10 to 15 years, sometimes more frequently, there was a spike in disappearances and violent encounters in this specific region of the Appalachians. The descriptions varied. Some witnesses called it a massive ape, others described something more humanoid. A few swore it was something that defied easy categorization, but certain details remained constant: the height, the incredible strength, the tracks, and that terrible screaming sound that echoed through the hollers. The most disturbing pattern emerged from the historical records. The creature seemed to focus its attention on lone individuals in positions of authority: hunters, surveyors, loggers, and especially rangers. People who spent significant time alone in the mountains, people whose routines became predictable. It studied them, learned their patterns, and then struck when they were most vulnerable, just like it was doing with me. My radio crackled. Hudson checking in for the evening report. I filled him in on what I'd discovered, the pattern I'd identified. "Leo, I'm going to be straight with you," he said after a long pause. "Every ranger who's lasted more than a few months at that station has experienced what you're going through. The watching, the stalking, the visits to the cabin. Some of them requested transfers before it escalated. The ones who stayed, He trailed off. What happened to them?
Nathaniel left, as you know. The ranger before him, a guy named Vincent, he disappeared on a routine trail maintenance patrol, never found a body, just his equipment scattered over a quarter-mile of forest. Before Vincent was Craig, who you read about in the journal. He made it out but barely, claims something chased him all the way to his truck one night, something that kept pace with him on two legs despite running through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in the dark.
I thought about the breathing sounds outside my window, the shadow I'd seen at Fletcher's Gorge, the feeling of being constantly observed that had only intensified over the past week. So what do I do? How do I stop this? Hudson's laugh was bitter. You don't stop it, Leo. This thing has been in these mountains for longer than we've been keeping records. Probably centuries, maybe longer. The Cherokee had stories about it, and they were here thousands of years before us. You don't stop something like that. You either leave or you adapt. Adapt how? The old-timers, the ones whose families have been in these hollers for generations, they have rules. Never go into the deep woods alone after dark. Never follow the screaming sounds. Don't investigate strange movements in your peripheral vision. Keep your lights on at night. Keep your weapons close. And never, ever show fear. They say it can smell fear, that it feeds on it somehow. After the radio call ended, I sat in the growing darkness, watching the forest through my window. The sun had set behind the mountains, and long shadows stretched across the clearing around the cabin. I could feel it out there, waiting, watching, patient as only something truly ancient could be patient. My phone buzzed a text from Claire at the sheriff's department. She'd been digging through old newspaper archives and found something she thought I should see. The attachment was a scan of a yellowed newspaper article from 1952. Creature sighting in Carter County mountains. Local residents report encounter with devil ape. The article described multiple witnesses who'd seen something matching the descriptions I'd been collecting: tall, covered in dark hair, walking upright, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. But what caught my attention was a quote from one of the witnesses, a coal miner named Albert. It wasn't just an animal. It was thinking, planning. I could see it in the way it moved, the way it positioned itself. It was hunting us, same way a man hunts deer. Maybe smarter than a man, if I'm being honest. And that's what scares me most. The intelligence behind those eyes. I was dealing with something that possessed animal strength but human-level intelligence, or perhaps something beyond both. A predator that had perfected its hunting strategies over countless generations, that had learned to exploit human psychology and behavior. The lights in my cabin flickered, and for one heart-stopping moment I was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, I saw it. Just for an instant, standing at the tree line exactly where it had been on that first night, impossibly tall, broader through the shoulders than any human, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb the light from my cabin, and its eyes, catching the glow from my window, reflected back at me like twin red embers. We stared at each other across the clearing, predator and prey, both of us knowing how this game was going to end. Then it stepped backward into the shadows and vanished, leaving only the swaying branches to mark its passing. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, doing a perimeter check even though every survival instinct screamed at me to stay inside. The tracks were there, fresh in the soft earth around my cabin. It had circled the building multiple times, had stood at each window, had tested the doors. The message was clear: it could reach me whenever it wanted. The cabin wasn't protection, it was just delaying the inevitable. Back inside, I barricaded the doors with furniture and settled in for what I knew would be another sleepless night. The journal lay open on my desk and I found myself reading the earliest entries, looking for any clue about how to survive what was coming. One entry from 1979, written by a ranger named Floyd, offered something approaching hope. It tests you, pushes your boundaries, sees how you react to fear. The ones who panic, who run blindly, who show weakness, those are the ones it takes. But I've noticed something else. When you stand your ground, when you face it with defiance instead of terror, it hesitates. Not for long, but enough. It's a predator, yes, but it's also cautious. It doesn't take unnecessary risks. Make yourself dangerous enough, unpredictable enough, and it might move on to easier prey. Might. No guarantees in these mountains. I held on to that word might as the hours crawled past and the darkness pressed against my windows. Outside I could hear something moving through the forest. Heavy footfalls that didn't bother with stealth anymore. It was done hiding, done testing. The real hunt was about to begin. The radio call came at dawn, just as exhaustion was finally pulling me toward sleep. Hudson's voice was tight with controlled urgency. Leo, we've got an emergency. Group of teenagers went camping in the Rockhouse Hollow area last night. One of them just called 911, says something attacked their camp, dragged one of their friends into the woods. We're mobilizing every available unit but your closest. How fast can you get there? I was already pulling on my boots, checking my rifle, grabbing my emergency pack. 20 minutes if I push it. But Hudson, Rockhouse Hollow is at least 6 miles from here. If this is the same thing that's been— I know what you're thinking, he cut me off. That it might be a diversion, that it might be drawing us away from your location. But these are kids, Leo. 17, 18 years old. We have to respond. He was right, of course. Whatever was happening with me, whatever game the creature was playing, it had to take second priority to an active emergency. I grabbed my gear and headed out into the cold November morning, the sky just beginning to lighten from black to deep blue. The drive to Rockhouse Hollow took 18 minutes of pushing my truck to its limits on roads that weren't meant for speed. I arrived to find 2 sheriff's vehicles already there, along with an ambulance and 3 terrified teenagers wrapped in emergency blankets. One of them, a girl named Scarlett, was sobbing into a deputy's shoulder while her friends, brothers named Caleb and Ezra, stood in shocked silence. Hudson pulled me aside. The missing kid is named Anthony. They were sleeping in 2 tents. Anthony was alone in the smaller one when something ripped through it around 3 a.m. His friends heard him screaming, saw something massive dragging him into the forest. By the time they got their flashlights out, both Anthony and the creature were gone. How long ago? 4 hours, maybe 4.5. If he's injured and bleeding— Hudson didn't need to finish the sentence. 4 hours of blood loss, potential shock, and exposure to near-freezing temperatures didn't leave much room for optimism. Show me the campsite. The scene was horrifyingly familiar. Another tent torn open with those 4 parallel slash marks, blood splattered across sleeping bags and camping equipment, and drag marks leading into the forest. But this time there was more blood, a lot more, and the drag marks showed signs of struggle, places where Anthony had clearly tried to resist, to slow down whatever was pulling him. The tracks were everywhere, dozens of them, suggesting the creature had circled the camp multiple times before attacking. Isaac, who'd arrived ahead of me, was documenting everything with grim efficiency. It was playing with them, he said, pacing around the camp, building their fear. You can see where it approached, then retreated, then approached again. This wasn't about hunger or territory, this was psychological. Claire was coordinating with the medical team while taking statements from the teenagers. I approached Scarlett, crouching down to her eye level. I know this is terrifying, but I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. Any details, no matter how strange they seem. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes. It was so tall. Taller than any person. Taller than anything I've ever seen. Covered in dark hair. But it walked like a person, on 2 legs. And its face. Her voice broke. Its face was wrong. Almost human, but distorted, stretched. And the smell, God, the smell was like death, and wet earth, and something else I can't describe. Did it make any sounds? When it was dragging Anthony, he was screaming for help, and it made this sound in response. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between, like it was answering him, or mocking him. Fresh tears streamed down her face. We just wanted to go camping. This was supposed to be fun. Hudson organized the search party. 8 of us total, including state troopers, local deputies, and a paramedic named Riley in case we found Anthony alive. We followed the drag marks and tracks into increasingly dense forest, climbing the steep slopes of Rockhouse Hollow. The trail was easy to follow at first. Disturbed earth, broken branches, occasional blood splatter on rocks and leaves. But the creature's route showed disturbing intelligence, choosing terrain that made pursuit difficult, natural corridors that minimized our sight lines, areas where the forest growth was so thick we had to proceed single file. It knows we're following, Isaac said quietly. Look at the track pattern. It's making this harder than it needs to be. Taking the most difficult path on purpose, slowing us down. We'd been tracking for almost 2 hours when Riley, who was examining a blood sample on a rock, called out, "This is fresh, very fresh. Maybe minutes old." We all went silent, weapons raised, scanning the forest around us. The normal sounds of the woods had ceased. No birds, no squirrels, not even wind through the branches. Just that oppressive silence that meant something predatory was near. Then we heard it, a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing off the hollow's walls. Not quite a growl, not quite a vocalization, but something that carried intelligence and intent, and underneath it, barely audible, a human voice crying weakly for help. "Anthony," Hudson breathed. "He's alive." We moved toward the sound, climbing a steep embankment choked with laurel thickets. At the top we found ourselves at the edge of a small clearing, and what we saw there would haunt me for the rest of my life. Anthony was alive, but barely. He lay against a fallen log, his legs clearly broken, his clothing soaked with blood from multiple deep lacerations. But he wasn't alone. The creature stood 20 feet away, partially concealed by a massive oak tree, watching us with eyes that held far too much awareness. In the morning light, I could finally see it clearly, nearly 8 feet tall, covered in coarse dark hair that had a reddish tint in certain angles, with shoulders impossibly broad and arms that hung almost to its knees. Its face was a nightmare mixture of ape and human features, the skull structure disturbingly humanoid, but stretched and distorted, with a pronounced brow ridge and a jaw that seemed too large for its face. But the eyes, those were the worst. Dark, intelligent eyes that studied our group with calculation and what might have been curiosity. It had positioned Anthony deliberately, I realized. Laid him out where we would find him, where he would serve as bait. The creature wasn't running, it was hunting, and we had just walked into its trap. "Nobody move," Hudson whispered. "Nobody make any sudden movements." The creature tilted its head, and I swear I saw something like recognition in its expression. It knew Hudson, knew me, knew that we'd been tracking it for weeks. This wasn't a random encounter, this was planned. Then it did something that made my blood turn to ice. It straightened to its full height, threw back its head and released that sound, that screaming wail that echoed through the hollers, part human shriek and part something beyond human vocal capabilities, sustained for almost a full minute without pause for breath. The sound reverberated off the rocky walls of the hollow, coming at us from every direction, disorienting and primal. "It's calling others," Isaac said, his voice tight with fear. "There might be more than one." As if in response, answering calls came from different points in the forest, higher up the slope, deeper in the hollow, from the ridgeline above us. We were surrounded. Hudson made a decision. "Dylan, Matthew, get to Anthony now. Everyone else, defensive perimeter. If they charge, aim for center mass and don't stop shooting until they go down." The next few minutes were chaos. Dylan and Matthew sprinted across the clearing while the rest of us formed a protective half-circle, weapons raised. The creature watching us didn't advance, but it didn't retreat either. It simply stood there, massive and patient, while those calls continued to echo through the forest. Dylan reached Anthony and began emergency first aid while Matthew provided cover. The teenager was in shock, muttering incoherently about things in the dark, about being dragged for miles, about the creature standing over him, studying him like he was a curiosity. "We need to move," Hudson said. "Now, before whatever else is out there decides to close in." Getting Anthony out was a nightmare. We fashioned a makeshift stretcher and began the treacherous descent back down the hollow, with half the team facing forward and half facing back, expecting an attack at any moment. The creature followed us. I could see glimpses of it moving through the trees parallel to our position, sometimes on the ground, sometimes impossibly high up in the canopy, keeping pace with ease despite the difficult terrain. Other shapes moved in the periphery of my vision, smaller than the primary creature, but still massive by human standards, darting between trees, maintaining distance but clearly coordinating their movements. A family group maybe, or a hunting party. The calls continued, complex vocalizations that sounded almost like language, communication flowing between them. We were halfway back to the trailhead when the primary creature made its move. It appeared directly in our path, 50 feet ahead, and just stood there blocking the trail. Up close, in full daylight, it was even more imposing, a creature that physics said shouldn't exist, that evolution couldn't have produced, yet undeniably real and terrifyingly present. Hudson raised his rifle. "Back away slowly. No one fires unless it attacks." But it didn't attack. Instead, it did something that changed everything. It reached up to a nearby tree, and with casual, terrible strength ripped a branch as thick as my leg clean off. Then it slammed the branch against the tree trunk 3 times. Crack, crack, crack. Each impact echoing through the forest like gunshots. A demonstration of power, a warning, a message. Then it stepped aside off the trail, giving us room to pass. "It's letting us go," Isaac whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. "It's actually letting us go." We hurried past, nobody daring to take their eyes off the creature. As I moved by, it turned its head to look directly at me, and in that moment I understood something fundamental about what we were dealing with. This wasn't just an animal. This was something with culture, with social structure, with intelligence that might rival or exceed our own. It had taken Anthony not to kill him, but to draw us out, to study us, to test our responses. We were the subjects of its curiosity, not just prey. When we finally reached the vehicles, getting Anthony into the ambulance, I looked back up the trail. The creature was visible one last time, standing at the edge of the forest, watching our group. Then it turned and vanished into the trees, followed by the other shapes that had been tracking us. Anthony survived, though his physical and psychological injuries would take years to heal. The county closed the entire region to recreational access, citing dangerous wildlife activity. The story made regional news for a few days before being forgotten in the endless cycle of modern media. That night, back at my cabin, I found one last entry I'd missed in Nathaniel's journal, written on the inside back cover. If you're reading this, you survived your first real encounter. Congratulations. But know this, you're marked now permanently. It will never fully leave you alone. You've been accepted into an ancient understanding between their kind and ours, an agreement older than written history. They stay in the deep places, we stay in the civilized lands, and the mountains between are contested ground. Sometimes they test us, sometimes we intrude too far into their territory, and sometimes there are consequences. But as long as we respect the boundaries, as long as we acknowledge what we share these mountains with, there can be coexistence. Uneasy, dangerous coexistence. You'll see it again, feel it watching. That's the price of working in these mountains. But if you show no weakness, if you stand your ground without aggression, it will leave you alive. That's their way. They take the weak, the foolish, and the disrespectful. Everyone else they watch, warn, and occasionally test. Welcome to the real Appalachia. Nothing will ever be the same. I closed the journal and looked out at the dark forest beyond my window. Somewhere out there, in the ancient hollers of these mountains, something looked back. An understanding passed between us, mutual recognition, mutual respect, mutual wariness. I would continue to work these mountains. It would continue to inhabit them. And between us would exist that razor-edge balance that had sustained itself for centuries, maybe millennia. The Appalachians had been here long before humans arrived, and they would remain long after we were gone. And in their deepest, darkest places, things lived that we had barely begun to understand. I was no longer just a ranger protecting people from the wilderness. I was a witness to something far older and stranger than my training had ever prepared me for. The screaming came again that night, echoing through the hollers, a sound that carried both warning and promise. I no longer reached for my weapon when I heard it. Instead, I simply listened, acknowledging the presence of my ancient neighbor. In these mountains, in this contested space between human civilization and primeval wilderness, new rules applied, and I had just learned the most important one. Survival wasn't about conquest or dominance. It was about respect, awareness, and the humility to acknowledge that some things in this world were bigger, older, and far more mysterious than we could ever hope to control. The mountains kept their secrets, and I had become one of the keepers. My name is Jack, and I've been a park ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 8 years now. As a Cherokee, these mountains are more than just my workplace. They're the bones of my ancestors, the sacred peaks where the stories of my people were born. My grandmother used to tell me that the Smokies remember everything, that they hold memories older than any written history. I never really understood what she meant until 3 months ago. It was late September when things started feeling wrong. The park was transitioning into autumn, and the tourist crowds were thinning as families returned to their regular lives. I preferred this time of year, the solitude, the way the mountains seemed to exhale after the summer chaos. But that particular week, the silence felt different, heavier somehow. I was patrolling the Cataloochee Valley area, one of the more remote sections of the park. The morning fog clung to the ground like wet cotton, and my boots left dark prints in the dew-soaked grass. I'd received a report about a damaged campsite near Palmer Creek, and I figured it was probably black bears getting into food supplies again. People never learn to properly secure their provisions, no matter how many warnings we give them. When I reached the campsite, I knew immediately this wasn't bears. The tent wasn't just damaged, it was shredded. Long, deliberate tears ran through the fabric, and the aluminum poles were bent at impossible angles. A cooler lay 30 feet away, completely intact but covered in what looked like handprints, massive handprints. I knelt down to examine them more closely, pulling out my measuring tape from my utility belt. The prints were at least 14 inches long, with distinctly separated digits. Not bear paws, not human hands either. I radioed it in, keeping my voice steady. "Base, this is Ranger 7. Got a situation at Palmer Creek campsite. Looks like vandalism, possibly wildlife related. Requesting backup for documentation." While I waited, I walked the perimeter. The campers had clearly left in a hurry, sleeping bags abandoned, personal items scattered, but no blood, thank God. No signs of injury, just terror and a hasty retreat. I found their vehicle registration caught on a branch, Tennessee plates, registered to a family named Morrison. What disturbed me most was the smell. It hung in the air like a physical presence, a mixture of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't identify. Something primal that made the hair on my neck stand up. I'd grown up in these mountains, spent countless nights under these trees, and I'd never encountered a smell like that. My backup arrived 20 minutes later. Sarah Chen, Another ranger who'd been with the Park Service longer than I had. She took one look at the campsite, and her expression hardened. "When did this happen?" she asked. "Best guess, sometime between midnight and dawn. The Morrisons checked in yesterday afternoon." Sarah photographed everything, but I could see the confusion in her eyes as she examined the handprints. "Jack, what the hell could do this?" I didn't answer because I didn't want to say what I was thinking. My grandmother's stories were flooding back, tales she'd told me as a child, warnings wrapped in the comfort of her kitchen, spoken in our native language so the spirits wouldn't understand and take offense. Stories about the Sulkalu, the great slant-eyed giant that walked the mountains. Stories about things that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human. We spent the rest of the day securing the area and trying to contact the Morrison family. When we finally reached them by phone, the father's voice was shaking so badly he could barely speak. "Something was circling our tent," he said. "Something huge. We could hear it breathing, hear branches breaking under its weight. When my wife turned on the flashlight, we saw something looking back at us through the tent wall. A shadow, but massive. The eyes reflected the light, but they were wrong, too high off the ground, too intelligent." After we hung up, Sarah looked at me. "You grew up around here. You ever heard of anything like this?" "Just stories," I said, which was true, but stories and reality were starting to blur in my mind. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the tree line at the edge of my property. I live in a cabin just outside the park boundaries, close enough to respond quickly to emergencies, isolated enough to maintain my sanity. The forest was unusually quiet. No owls, no crickets, no rustling of nocturnal animals going about their business. Just silence, and the feeling of being watched. I thought about calling my grandmother, but it was late, and besides I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what she might say. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started researching. Reports from other rangers, incidents logged but never explained. I found more than I expected: strange footprints, damaged property, frightened hikers reporting encounters with something that shouldn't exist. The Smokies hold their secrets close, my grandmother always said. But sometimes those secrets decide to show themselves. I just didn't know yet how much they were about to reveal. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and purple, I made myself a promise. Whatever was happening in my park, whatever was terrifying visitors and leaving impossible evidence, I was going to find out. It was my duty as a ranger, and more than that, it was my responsibility as someone whose ancestors had walked these ridges for thousands of years. The mountains were speaking. It was time I learned to listen. 3 days after the Palmer Creek incident, I volunteered for night patrol along the Appalachian Trail corridor. Most rangers avoid night shifts if they can. The trails are dangerous enough in daylight, and our resources are stretched thin as it is. But I needed to be out there. I needed to understand what was happening in these mountains. I started my patrol at Klingman's Dome just before sunset, watching as the last tourist descended from the observation tower. The parking lot emptied quickly. People don't linger in the Smokies after dark, especially not the locals. They know better, even if they can't articulate why. My route would take me along a 12-mile section of the AT, checking on designated campsites and making sure hikers were following regulations. I carried my standard equipment: flashlight, radio, first aid kit, bear spray, but I'd also brought my grandfather's old hunting knife, the one with the bone handle wrapped in leather. It felt foolish, carrying a knife against something that could bend tent poles like pipe cleaners, but it gave me comfort. The first few hours were routine. I checked 3 shelters, talked with a couple of through hikers who were making good time on their northbound journey, and documented a poorly extinguished campfire. The moon was 3/4 full, providing decent visibility once my eyes adjusted. The trail wound through stands of spruce fir forest, the ancient trees standing like silent witnesses to whatever walked among them. Around 11 p.m., I stopped at the Peck's Corner shelter for a scheduled break. The shelter was empty, which wasn't unusual for a weeknight. I sat on the wooden sleeping platform, ate a protein bar, and updated my log. The night sounds of the forest created a familiar symphony. Wind through the evergreens, the distant call of a barred owl, the creek running somewhere in the darkness below. Then, everything stopped. The silence hit like a physical blow. No wind, no water, no insects or birds. Just dead, suffocating quiet. I stood up slowly, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt. My breath seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and coming from the north along the trail. But the rhythm was wrong. Not the steady 2-beat cadence of a human hiker, and not the 4-legged pattern of a bear. It was something else. Something that walked upright but moved with an inhuman gait. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the back wall of the shelter. trying to control my breathing. My Cherokee grandfather taught me to hunt, taught me patience and stillness. I used every bit of that training now. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear branches breaking, the heavy tread on the forest floor. Whatever was approaching was massive, moving with the confidence of something that had no natural predators. Through a gap in the shelter's logs, I caught my first glimpse. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The body was powerful, heavily muscled, with arms that hung past where its knees would be. But what made my blood freeze was the face. Even in the dim light, I could see it wasn't quite ape-like, wasn't quite human. It was something in between, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd learned. The creature stopped about 20 yards from the shelter. It turned its head slowly, methodically, as if scanning the area. I could hear it breathing deep, rumbling breaths that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Then it raised its head and sniffed the air, testing, searching. I remained absolutely motionless. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be fatal. This thing was built for these mountains. It knew every trail, every hiding place. My only advantage was stillness. The creature moved closer to the shelter. I could smell it now, that same rotting, musky odor from the Palmer Creek campsite. It circled the structure slowly, its footfalls shaking the wooden platform where I stood. Through the gaps in the logs, I watched as one massive hand, because it was definitely a hand, not a paw, reached out and gripped the edge of the shelter's opening. I held my breath. My heart hammered so hard I was certain the creature could hear it. Time stretched into an eternity as that hand rested there, just inches from where I stood, pressed against the wall. I could see the individual fingers, the dark leathery palm, the ridges that might have been prints or might have been scars. Then, somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and in one fluid motion it released the shelter and moved off into the forest. The speed was terrifying. Something that large shouldn't be able to move that fast, that silently. Within seconds, it had vanished into the darkness, leaving only the lingering smell and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I waited a full 10 minutes before I dared to move. My legs were shaking, and my hands trembled as I fumbled for my radio. I pressed the transmit button, then released it. What would I say? That I'd just seen a Bigfoot? That the Cherokee stories my grandmother told were real? They'd pull me from field duty, maybe mandate a psychological evaluation. Instead, I turned my flashlight back on and examined the shelter's entrance. There, in the dirt, was a perfect handprint. I took out my phone and photographed it, making sure to include my measuring tape for scale. 16 inches long, 7 inches wide, 5 distinct digits with what appeared to be dermal ridges. I didn't finish my patrol that night. I radioed in that I was cutting it short due to equipment malfunction, a lie that sat heavy on my conscience. But as I hiked back to my truck in the pre-dawn darkness, I knew my understanding of these mountains had fundamentally changed. My grandmother was right. The Smokies remember everything, and some of those memories walk on 2 legs in the darkness, following trails older than our country, older than our written history. The question wasn't whether these creatures existed. I'd just proven that to myself beyond any doubt. The question was what else was out here, hidden in the forests and hollows, and why were they suddenly making themselves known? I called my grandmother the next morning. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm and knowing in a way that made me feel like a child again. "Jack, you've seen something." It wasn't a question. I'd learned long ago not to be surprised by her intuition, or perhaps it was something more than intuition. She'd been a medicine woman before her arthritis made the ceremonies too difficult, and she carried knowledge that stretched back generations. "Elise," I said, using the Cherokee word for grandmother, "I need to talk to you about the old stories, about the Sulkalu." There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming more serious. "Come to my house tonight. This isn't a conversation for the phone." I spent the day filing reports and catching up on administrative work, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about that handprint, about the intelligence I'd seen in the way the creature moved. This wasn't some animal operating on instinct. This was something aware, something purposeful. Sarah found me in the office around 3 p.m. She dropped a folder on my desk. "You need to see these." Inside were incident reports from the past 6 weeks, all from different areas of the park. A trail crew heard howling that didn't match any known animal. Hikers reported a foul smell near Laurel Falls. Security cameras at Cades Cove caught something large crossing a field at night. The footage was grainy, but the shape was unmistakably bipedal. And 2 days ago, a maintenance worker found livestock killed on a farm bordering the park, not eaten, just killed and left. "Jack, something's happening." Sarah said quietly. And I don't think it's just one thing. These reports describe different creatures, different behaviors. She was right. I'd been so focused on what I'd seen at Peck's Corner that I hadn't connected the other incidents. The howling didn't match a sulkalu. That sounded more like the stories about the waya, the wolf people my grandmother called skinwalkers when speaking English. And the livestock kills had a different signature entirely. I need a few days off, I said suddenly. Sarah frowned. Jack, we're short-staffed as it is. I know. But I need to talk to some people, do some research. Trust me, it'll help. I met her eyes. Sarah, we're dealing with something beyond normal protocol here. You know it, and I know it. Let me figure out what. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. 3 days, but stay in contact. That evening, I drove to my grandmother's house in Cherokee, North Carolina, just outside the reservation boundaries. She lived in a small cabin that my grandfather had built 50 years ago, surrounded by gardens where she grew herbs and medicinal plants. Smoke rose from her chimney, and I could smell sage burning before I even reached the door. She was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl despite the mild evening. Her face was deeply lined, her hair completely white, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Come inside, she said. We have much to discuss. Her living room was exactly as I remembered. Walls covered in family photographs, woven baskets hanging from the ceiling, and her altar in the corner with its candles and sacred objects. She gestured for me to sit at her kitchen table while she made tea. Tell me everything, she said. Leave nothing out. I did. I told her about Palmer Creek, about the night patrol, about all the reports Sarah had shown me. She listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if confirming something she already knew. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke in Cherokee, the old language flowing naturally from her. The boundaries are weakening. What boundaries? Between the worlds, between what walks in light and what walks in shadow. She switched to English, perhaps sensing I needed the clarity. Our people have stories about these creatures for a reason, Jack. They're not myths, they're memories. Warnings passed down because our ancestors encountered them and survived. But why now? Why are they suddenly appearing more frequently? She poured the tea, her hands steady despite their age. The land is sick. Too many people, too much noise, too much disrespect. The creatures that have hidden for generations are being pushed out of their deep places. And when they're pushed, they push back. What about the different types? The Tsulkalu I saw. The howling Sarah mentioned. The livestock kills. The mountains hold many secrets, Jack. The Tsulkalu. What the white people call Bigfoot. They're guardians of sorts. They keep to themselves mostly. Avoid humans when possible. What you encountered was probably curious. Maybe warning you to stay away from its territory. She paused, her expression darkening. But there are others. The Waya, who wear the skins of wolves and walk like men. They're hunters, and they don't fear humans the way the forest giants do.
And the livestock kills?
She took a slow sip of tea. That sounds like something worse. Something that kills for pleasure, not food. We call them raven mockers in our tongue spirits that take physical form to spread fear and death. But the white people have another name for them. Skinwalkers, I said quietly. She nodded. They're the most dangerous because they were human once. They know how we think, how we act. They can mimic us, trick us. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the cabin. Elise, what am I supposed to do? I'm a park ranger, not a medicine man. I can't fight these things. You don't fight them, Jack. You respect them. You give them space. You warn people away from the areas where they're active. She reached across the table and took my hand. But more than anything, you remember that you carry the blood of those who've dealt with these creatures for thousands of years. You have knowledge in your bones, even if you don't realize it. Trust your instincts. We talked for another hour. She gave me tobacco and sage, taught me prayers in Cherokee that I'd forgotten or never learned. She told me stories about her own encounters, things she'd seen as a young woman working as a guide in the mountains. By the time I left, the moon was high and full. As I drove back toward the park, I thought about boundaries between the known and unknown, between the modern world and the ancient one that existed beneath it. I'd spent my career protecting people from bears and weather and their own stupidity. Now I was facing something that required a different kind of protection, a different kind of knowledge. My grandmother was right about one thing. This was only the beginning. I returned to work with a new perspective and a plan. If these creatures were being pushed out of their territories, I needed to identify those territories and keep people away from them. It meant more night patrols, more time alone in the wilderness, more opportunities to encounter things that shouldn't exist. Sarah wasn't thrilled with my request to focus on remote area monitoring, but she approved it. Just promise me you'll be careful, she said. And Jack, whatever you're not telling me about what's really going on out there, I hope you know what you're doing. I spent the next week establishing a pattern. During the day, I studied topographic maps and cross-referenced them with incident reports, looking for clusters. 3 areas stood out: the Deep Creek watershed, the Cataloochee backcountry, and the remote sections around Fontana Lake. All 3 were places where the forest grew thick and old, where humans rarely ventured. At night, I patrolled the boundaries of these areas, not entering them directly, but watching, listening, documenting. I followed my grandmother's advice, leaving tobacco at the forest edge as a sign of respect. It felt strange at first, performing these old rituals while wearing my ranger uniform and carrying modern equipment. But something about it felt right too, like I was honoring both parts of my heritage. On the 8th night, everything changed. I was monitoring a trail junction near Fontana when I heard the howling. It wasn't like anything I'd encountered before. Not wolves, not coyotes, not any natural animal. It started low and mournful, then rose to a pitch that made my teeth ache. And it was close, too close. I grabbed my radio. Base, this is Ranger 7. I've got unusual wildlife activity near Fontana. Grid reference. The howling came again, cutting off my words. This time it was answered by another call from the opposite direction. Then another, and another. They were surrounding me. I killed my flashlight and moved off the trail, using the darkness and my knowledge of the terrain to put distance between myself and the sounds. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. The wire are hunters. They don't fear humans. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement, shapes that ran on 4 legs but were too large, too fluid. Occasionally, they would rise up on 2 legs, and I could see the humanoid silhouette. The stories were true. These were people who'd taken the form of wolves, or wolves that had learned to walk like people. Either way, they were hunting. The question was whether they were hunting me or something else. I found shelter in a rocky outcropping, wedging myself into a crevice where I'd be protected from at least 3 sides. My hand gripped the bear spray, though I doubted it would be effective against creatures like this. The bone-handled knife felt more appropriate, more in keeping with the ancient nature of what I was facing. The howling stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I waited, controlling my breathing, listening to every sound. Minutes passed like hours. Then I heard it, footsteps, but not the heavy tread of the sulcaloo I'd encountered before. These were lighter, faster, more numerous. Whatever was out there was moving as a pack. A shadow passed in front of my hiding spot, then another. I pressed myself deeper into the crevice, willing myself to become part of the stone. Through a narrow gap, I watched as a figure paused just feet away. It stood on 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. Too much muscle in the haunches, arms that hung too long, a head that jutted forward with a predator's alertness. In the moonlight, I could see fur covering most of its body, but the face was a horrifying mixture of human and wolf. It turned its head, and for a moment our eyes met. There was intelligence there. Recognition. It knew what I was, just as I knew what it was. The creature opened its mouth, and a sound emerged that was neither growl nor words, but somehow both. It was a warning, or perhaps a challenge. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it moved on, following its pack deeper into the forest. I stayed in that crevice until dawn, not trusting the silence that eventually returned. When I finally emerged stiff and cold, I found tracks everywhere. Paw prints that occasionally became something like footprints, then back to paws again. Whatever these creatures were, they moved between forms with ease. I also found something else, a deer carcass, or what remained of it. But this wasn't a normal kill. The animal had been torn apart with savage efficiency, and there were marks that looked disturbingly like handprints on the bones. More unsettling was what had been done to the remains. They'd been arranged in a pattern, almost ritualistic. This wasn't about food. This was about territory, about sending a message. I documented everything, took photographs, collected what samples I could. When I radioed in, I kept my report vague. Aggressive wildlife, possible wolf activity, recommending the area be closed to hikers. Sarah approved the closure without question. Maybe she was starting to understand there were questions better left unasked. That afternoon, I received a call from a ranger station on the Tennessee side of the park. There had been another incident. A hiker had stumbled into camp claiming something had followed him for miles. Something that walked sometimes on 2 legs and sometimes on 4. The description matched what I'd seen the previous night. But what disturbed me more was the hiker's final comment. It felt like it was hurting me, pushing me in a specific direction, like it was playing with me. The Waya were becoming bolder. Whether that was because their territory was shrinking, or because they'd decided humans were fair game, I couldn't say. But I knew we were entering dangerous territory, both literally and figuratively. That night I called my grandmother again. They're hunting in packs, I told her, and they're not afraid of people anymore. Then you need to make a choice, Jack, she said quietly. You can try to manage this from the outside, close trails and hope people stay away, or you can go deeper, find out what's really driving them from their homes, maybe find a way to restore the balance. That's not really a choice, Elise. No, she agreed. I didn't think it was, but I had to give you the option anyway. We both knew what came next. If I wanted answers, I'd have to go into the deep places, the areas marked on no maps where even experienced rangers feared to tread. I'd have to face not just the creatures themselves, but whatever was forcing them into conflict with humans. The mountains were calling me deeper into their mysteries, and I was running out of reasons to refuse. 3 days of preparation. That's what I gave myself before venturing into the heart of the territory I'd identified as the epicenter of the disturbances, a remote section of the park where Hazel Creek and Eagle Creek converged, creating a wilderness area that few people ever visited. The maps showed nothing but contour lines and the occasional notation about impassable terrain. My grandmother called it the old place, where the mountains remembered their first names. I told Sarah I was conducting an extended backcountry survey. She looked at me with an expression that said she knew I was lying but had decided not to push. Take a satellite phone, she insisted, and check in every 12 hours. If I don't hear from you, I'm sending search and rescue. Agreed. I packed light minimal camping gear, enough food for 5 days, water purification, first aid, and the tools my grandmother had given me. Tobacco, sage, a medicine bundle she'd prepared with prayers I didn't fully understand. I also carried my grandfather's knife and a flare gun. If something went catastrophically wrong, I wanted the option to signal for help. The hike-in took most of the first day. I followed legitimate trails for the first 6 miles, then struck out into true wilderness using compass and GPS to navigate terrain that hadn't seen human presence in years, maybe decades. The forest changed as I went deeper. The trees grew larger, more ancient, their canopy blocking out much of the sky. The undergrowth became denser, and the animal sound shifted to species I rarely encountered near the popular areas. By late afternoon, I found what I was looking for, a clearing where 3 creeks met, creating a natural amphitheater of stone and water. In the center stood a rock formation that didn't look entirely natural, too symmetrical, too purposeful. My grandmother had told me about places like this, sacred sites where the Cherokee had conducted ceremonies generations ago. I made camp at the edge of the clearing, following the protocol she'd taught me. I placed tobacco at the cardinal directions, spoke the prayers she'd given me, and made it clear through word and action that I came as a visitor, not an intruder. Then I waited. Night fell quickly in the deep forest. I built a small fire, more for ceremony than warmth, and sat with my back to a large oak. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified here, water rushing over stone, wind through the ancient trees, the calls of owls and nightjars. But underneath it all, there was something else, a presence, watching and waiting. Around midnight they came. The Tsul'kalu appeared first, emerging from the darkness like a piece of the forest coming to life. The one I'd encountered before, I thought, recognizing the reddish-brown fur and the particular way it moved. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching me with those disturbingly intelligent eyes. I remained still, showing no fear, no aggression, just acknowledgement. More figures appeared. Another Tsul'kalu, slightly smaller. Then the Waya, 3 of them, moving between the trees in their unsettling way, part wolf and part human. They kept their distance but positioned themselves in a loose circle around the clearing. And then came something I hadn't expected. A figure walked into the firelight on 2 legs, completely human in appearance except for its eyes, which reflected the flames like an animal's. It wore tattered clothing that might have been a park ranger uniform once, decades ago. When it spoke, the voice was gravelly, wrong, like it had forgotten how human speech worked. "You carry the old blood," it said. "We can smell it on you." I found my voice. "I'm Cherokee. These mountains are my ancestral home, just as they're yours." The figure tilted its head. The mountains belong to no one, but they remember those who respect them. It moved closer, and I could see the wrongness now, the way the skin seemed too tight, the way the proportions were slightly off. This was a skinwalker, something that had been human once but had transformed itself through means I didn't want to contemplate. "Why are you coming into the human areas?" I asked. "Why are you revealing yourselves now?" The skinwalker gestured toward the darkness beyond the clearing. "Come, we'll show you." Every instinct screamed at me not to follow, but I'd come here for answers. I stood slowly, left my pack but took my flashlight and knife. The skinwalker led the way, and the other creatures followed at a distance. an escort or guards, I couldn't tell which. We walked for perhaps half a mile, deeper into territory that might never have seen human presence. The forest floor rose steadily, and I began to notice changes, dead trees, but not from natural causes. They'd been poisoned or diseased. The ground itself felt wrong underfoot, and there was a chemical smell in the air that didn't belong in wilderness. We emerged onto a ridge, and below us I saw the source of the problem. A massive sinkhole had opened in the valley floor, and from it came the unmistakable evidence of toxic waste. Even in the darkness I could see the discoloration, the dead vegetation, the unnatural sheen on the water flowing from the site. This wasn't natural. This was old contamination, probably from illegal dumping decades ago, now working its way to the surface. Your people did this, the skinwalker said. Long before you were born, they buried their poison in our home, thinking the earth would swallow it and forget. But the earth never forgets. I stared at the devastation. How long has this been here? The opening came 3 seasons ago. At first it was small, now it grows. The water that feeds the entire valley is poisoned. The animals sicken and die. Our hunting grounds shrink each moon. Understanding crashed over me. These creatures weren't becoming more aggressive out of malice. They were being displaced by environmental disaster. Everything I'd seen, every encounter, was because their habitat was being destroyed by contamination. Why didn't you report it? I asked. Then immediately felt foolish. How would they report it? Who would believe them? We have no voice in your world, the skinwalker replied. But you do. You wear the uniform that means protection. You carry the blood that means understanding. You are the bridge between the worlds. I looked at the assembled creatures, the Silkaloo standing patiently, the Waya watching with predatory alertness, the skinwalker studying me with those wrong eyes. They hadn't gathered here to threaten me. They'd gathered to show me the truth, to ask for help in the only way they could. I'll fix this, I said. I can't promise it will be quick, but I'll make sure the right people know about this contamination. I'll get the cleanup started. And what of us? The skinwalker asked. When your people come with their machines and their chemicals, they will destroy what remains of our home. That was the harder problem, and we both knew it. I'll find you new territory. There are sections of the park that could support you. Areas where humans rarely go. I'll make sure they're permanently protected. The skinwalker looked at the others, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. Finally, it turned back to me. We accept this bargain, but know that we will be watching. If your people fail to honor this agreement, there will be consequences. Understood. As dawn approached, the creatures melted back into the forest, leaving me alone on the ridge overlooking the contaminated valley. I spent the next hour documenting everything, taking photographs and GPS coordinates, collecting water samples despite the risk. This evidence would be enough to trigger a full environmental investigation. The hike back to my camp took most of the morning. I packed up, made one final offering of tobacco to the land, and started the long trek back to civilization. My satellite phone had 17 missed calls from Sarah, and when I finally called her back, I could hear the relief in her voice. Where the hell have you been? Finding answers, I said. I need you to contact the regional EPA office immediately. We've got a major environmental incident that's been festering for decades. The next weeks were chaos, environmental teams, investigations, media attention, and bureaucratic nightmares. But the cleanup began. The contaminated soil was removed, the water was treated, and the valley began the slow process of healing. I also made good on my promise. Working with park administrators and using every bit of influence I had, I got 3 remote sections of the park designated as restricted wilderness areas, off limits to all human activity. It was presented as an ecological preservation measure, which wasn't wrong, just not complete. The encounters stopped. Oh, there were still occasional sightings, glimpses of something in the forest, unexplained sounds, the feeling of being watched, but the aggressive incidents ceased. The creatures had their space back, and an understanding had been reached. Sarah never asked me directly what I'd found in the deep places, but sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with a question in her eyes. I'd just smile and change the subject. Some things are better left as mysteries, at least for those who aren't ready to understand. My grandmother was proud, though she'd never say it outright. You walked between the worlds, she told me. Not many can do that and come back whole. I had a good teacher, I replied. As for me, I continue my work as a ranger, protecting these mountains and the people who visit them. But I also protect something else now, the secret that these forests hold, the ancient inhabitants who remember when the Cherokee were new to these ridges. I am the bridge between worlds, just as the skinwalker said. The mountains still speak to those who listen, and now I understand the language. Sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling the remote sections, I'll find tobacco left by the trail in the same way I leave offerings, a sign of respect returned, a covenant honored. The creatures and I have an understanding now. They stay in their territories and I keep people away from those boundaries. It's an imperfect solution, I know. But it's the best we can do in a world where the ancient and modern must find ways to coexist. The Smokies hold their secrets close, just as my grandmother always said. But some of us are trusted to help keep them. And that responsibility, I've learned, is the greatest honor of all. My name is Leo, and I've been a wilderness guide in the Appalachian Mountains for 7 years. I thought I'd seen everything these ancient peaks had to offer. Black bears at dusk, cougars stalking deer, storms that could strip bark from trees. I was wrong, dead wrong. It started on a Tuesday in late October when the leaves had turned to rust and blood. I was leading a 3-day backcountry expedition for a group of 5 clients who'd paid good money to experience the real Appalachians, far from the tourist trails and overlooked parking lots. They wanted isolation. They wanted wilderness. Looking back, I wish I'd turned them all around at the trailhead. The group was manageable enough. Matthew and his wife Claire, both in their 40s and experienced hikers, Jordan and Emma, a young couple from Charlotte celebrating their engagement, and Silas, a quiet man in his mid-50s who kept to himself and carried an expensive camera with a telephoto lens that probably cost more than my truck. We'd hiked 9 miles into the Cohutta wilderness, deeper than most people venture following old logging roads that had surrendered to the forest decades ago. Our destination was an abandoned fire lookout tower perched on Grassy Ridge, a remote peak that offered 360-degree views of endless mountain ranges. The tower hadn't been manned since the 1970s, but the Forest Service maintained the site as a primitive campground, a clearing with a fire ring and not much else. We arrived at the base of the tower around 4 in the afternoon. The structure loomed above us, a skeletal frame of rusted steel rising 70 feet into the canopy. Wooden stairs zigzagged up its sides. Many of the treads rotted through or missing entirely. The observation cabin at the top was little more than a shell with broken windows and a door hanging by one hinge. "Is it safe to climb?" Jordan asked, tilting his head back to study the tower.
"The stairs are sketchy," I admitted, dropping my pack. "But I've been up twice before. Just watch your step and test each board before you commit your weight."
While the others set up their tents in the clearing below, Silas immediately started toward the tower with his camera. "I'm going up before we lose the light," he announced, not really asking permission. Something made me uneasy about him going up alone, though I couldn't say exactly what. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to lean toward the tower, or how the forest had gone unnaturally quiet since we'd arrived. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums. "Hold up," I called, jogging after him. "I'll come with you." The climb was worse than I remembered. Bolts had loosened, and the entire structure swayed in the wind that picked up as we ascended. Halfway up, I glanced down and immediately regretted it. The ground seemed impossibly far away, and Matthew was looking up at us with obvious concern. The observation cabin at the top was worse than decrepit. Decades of weather had reduced it to a few walls with gaping holes, a floor scattered with broken glass and animal droppings, and the skeletal remains of old equipment. But the view was exactly as I remembered. Waves of mountains extending to every horizon, their peaks fading into blue-gray distance like a frozen ocean. Silas immediately went to the western windows and began setting up his camera on a small tripod. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "This is perfect," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "The light is perfect." I left him to his photography and walked to the northern windows, looking out over the valley we'd hiked through. That's when I noticed something odd. About half a mile away, near a rock outcropping we'd passed that morning, something large was moving through the trees. At first I thought it might be a bear, but the movement was wrong, too upright, too deliberate. I pulled out my binoculars and focused on the area. What I saw made my stomach clench. It was tall, easily 7 feet, covered in dark brown hair that caught the late afternoon light. It moved between the trees with a strange, fluid gait, not quite human, but not entirely animal either. As I watched, it stopped at the rock outcropping and seemed to examine the ground. We'd taken a water break there that morning. It was following our trail. "Silas," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come look at this." He was at my side in seconds, and I handed him the binoculars. I watched his face as he found what I'd been looking at. His eyes widened and his breath caught. "Is that—" "I don't know," I interrupted, though we both knew exactly what it looked like. Every guide in these mountains had heard the stories. Old-timers talked about them around campfires. Hikers claimed to have found footprints, but I'd never believed it. Never wanted to believe it. We watched in silence as the creature moved closer, following our trail with unmistakable purpose. It would stop every so often, bending down as if to sniff the ground, then continue on its path toward our camp. "We need to get down," Silas said, his voice tight. "We need to warn the others." But as we turned toward the stairs, we both froze. In the growing shadows at the base of the tower, 3 more figures had emerged from the tree line. They were smaller than the first, but their shape was unmistakable. Broad-shouldered, covered in hair, moving with that same unsettling gait. And they were surrounding our camp. Matthew had seen them too. I could hear his shouts, faint but panicked, drifting up to us. The other campers were scrambling, their small figures moving frantically around their tents. Claire was trying to gather gear. Jordan and Emma were backing toward the fire ring, holding their hiking poles like weapons. The creatures moved slowly, deliberately, forming a loose circle around the clearing. They didn't rush in. They didn't need to. We were exactly where they wanted us. "Oh God," Silas whispered. "Oh God, we're trapped." He was right. The creatures below blocked any escape route, and the one we'd seen in the distance was still approaching, cutting off our only trail out. We were 70 feet up in a rotting tower with no way down and darkness coming fast. I pulled out my radio, hoping desperately for a signal this far out, but got only static. My satellite phone was in my pack 60 feet below in a camp now surrounded by things that shouldn't exist. "What do we do?" Silas asked, his face pale in the dying light. I looked down at our campsite, at the 3 people trapped below, then out at the approaching figure in the trees. The sun was touching the horizon now, and the mountains were filling with shadows that seemed to move with purpose. "We wait," I said, though I had no idea what we were waiting for. "And we pray they lose interest when it gets dark." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Whatever these things were, they hadn't followed us 9 miles into the wilderness by accident. They hadn't surrounded our camp because they were curious. They'd hunted us. And now, as the last light bled from the sky and the forest came alive with sounds I'd never heard before, deep grunts and howls that echoed off the mountains, I realized with cold certainty that we'd been prey from the moment we entered these woods. The real horror was only beginning.
Darkness swallowed the mountain faster than I'd ever seen. One moment the sky was deep purple, and the next we were wrapped in blackness so complete it felt solid. The temperature plummeted, and our breath became visible in the beam of my headlamp.
Below us, Matthew had gotten a fire going. It was bigger than it should have been. He'd clearly broken our leave-no-trace protocols and was burning whole branches, creating flames that leaped 6 feet high. Smart. Fire was our only advantage now. Through the gaps in the cabin floor, we could see the creatures circling just beyond the firelight. They never came close enough for a clear view, always staying in that zone where shadows and light blur together. But I could see their shapes, massive, powerful, moving with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. "They're studying us," Silas said. He'd abandoned his camera and was pressed against the wall, eyes fixed on the clearing below. "Look how they're moving. They're testing the perimeter, looking for weaknesses." He was right. The creatures would approach from one side, and when Matthew threw a burning branch in that direction, they'd fade back and probe from another angle. It was coordinated, strategic. My radio crackled suddenly, making us both jump. "Leo." Matthew's voice was strained, barely controlled. "Leo, can you hear me?" I fumbled for the radio. "I'm here. Are you all okay?" "For now." Claire's in shock. She won't stop shaking. The kids are holding it together, but barely. "What the hell are these things?" I didn't know what to tell him. The truth seemed impossible, but so did everything else about this situation. "I don't know," I admitted. "Just keep the fire high and don't let them separate you. Stay in a tight group." "There's 4 of them now," Matthew said. "A big one joined the others about 10 minutes ago. It's huge, Leo. It has to be 8 feet tall. And the smell. Jesus, you can smell them from here, like rotting meat and wet dog and something worse." I'd caught whiffs of it too, drifting up to us on the wind. It was the smell of a predator's den, of old kills and territorial marking. "We spotted something else," Matthew continued, his voice dropping. "There's a trail of, I don't know what to call them, structures, about 50 yards north of camp. Stacks of rocks and branches twisted together. They weren't there when we set up. Territorial markers. I'd heard about them in the old stories. Signs that you'd entered claimed territory. Warnings from creatures that viewed humans as intruders. We'd missed them in daylight. Or maybe they'd been put there after we arrived. "Matthew, listen to me carefully," I said. "You need to make it through tonight. Come dawn, they might leave. A lot of these creatures are nocturnal. You know what these things are." His voice rose. "You've seen them before?" "No." I said quickly. But I've heard stories from old-timers, hunters, people who've spent their whole lives in these mountains. I paused, trying to think of something reassuring to say and finding nothing. Just stay by the fire. We'll figure this out when the sun comes up. But even as I said it, a new sound rose from the forest. A howl that started low and climbed to a shriek that echoed off the peaks. It was answered by others from different directions surrounding us completely. The sound wasn't quite animal, not quite human. It was something older, something that made every instinct in my body scream to run. They're communicating, Silas whispered. They're talking to each other. The creatures below had stopped circling. They stood at the edge of the firelight, and for the first time I got a clear look at one of them. It was the big one Matthew had mentioned, easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a doorway. Its face was partially human, partially ape-like, with a pronounced brow ridge, and eyes that reflected the firelight like a cat's. Those eyes held intelligence, awareness. It made a sound, a series of grunts and clicks that the others seemed to respond to. Then it did something that stopped my heart. It picked up a rock and threw it at the fire. The stone hit the flames with enough force to scatter burning logs across the clearing. Matthew scrambled to push them back together while Claire screamed. The creatures pressed closer, emboldened. They're trying to put out the fire, I said numbly. They're trying to eliminate our defense. More rocks came flying in from the darkness, big ones, thrown with terrifying accuracy. One struck Matthew's shoulder and knocked him down. Emma ran to help him while Jordan grabbed the biggest burning branch he could lift and waved it at the advancing shapes. We have to get down there, Silas said, moving toward the stairs. We have to help them. I grabbed his arm. We go down there, we die. The tower is the only thing keeping us alive. They could have climbed up here by now if they wanted to. Then why haven't they? I didn't have an answer. Maybe they viewed the tower as a trap, a dead-end structure they didn't need to enter because we'd have to come down eventually. Or maybe there was something about the steel frame they didn't like. Some instinctual aversion. I'd heard stories about strange rules these creatures followed, territorial boundaries and behaviors that didn't always make sense. Below us, Matthew had gotten the fire rebuilt, but it was smaller now, and I could see they were running out of easy fuel. The creatures had pulled back slightly, but they hadn't left. They were just waiting. The night stretched on with agonizing slowness. Every sound from the forest made us jump. Breaking branches, strange vocalizations, movements through the underbrush. The creatures would disappear for 20 minutes at a time, and we'd start to hope they'd lost interest. Then they'd return, circling again, occasionally throwing stones or making those horrible howling calls. Around 2 in the morning, Emma's scream cut through the darkness.
Something touched the tent. Something put its hand on the tent.
Through the cabin floor, I could see one of the creatures had broken from the pack and approached the cluster of tents. It was hunched over Emma and Jordan's tent, and even from 70 feet up, I could see the massive handprint it left in the fabric, fingers as thick as broom handles, pressing into the nylon. The big one made a grunting sound, and the creature pulled back. It hadn't torn the tent, hadn't tried to grab anyone through the fabric. It had just touched it, marked it. They're playing with us, Silas said, his voice hollow, like cats with mice. 4 hours until dawn. 4 hours that felt like 4 years. At some point, exhaustion caught up with us. Silas slumped against the wall and dozed fitfully. I tried to stay alert, monitoring the scene below, but my eyes kept drifting closed. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep fatigue. I woke to Silas shaking my shoulder. The sky was starting to lighten in the east. Not sunrise yet, but that gray pre-dawn glow that meant morning was coming. Leo, Silas whispered. They're leaving. I looked down at the camp. The creatures were moving back into the forest, fading into the shadows between the trees. The big one was the last to go, and before it disappeared, it turned back toward our tower. Even at this distance, I felt the weight of its gaze. Then it was gone, and we were alone with the first birds beginning to sing, and the mountain slowly revealing itself in the growing light. Is it over? Silas asked. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that with daylight came safety. But as I looked down at our camp, the scattered fire, the torn tent fabric, the massive handprints in the dirt, I knew the truth. It was only over if we left, right now, before they decided to come back. We waited until full sunrise before attempting to descend. The stairs felt even more treacherous after a sleepless night, and my hands shook as I gripped the rusted railings. Silas went first, testing each step carefully, and I followed close behind. Matthew met us at the bottom. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday, face haggard, eyes bloodshot, a massive bruise blooming on his shoulder where the rock had struck him. We need to leave, he said flatly. Right now. We leave everything except water and essential gear. We move fast and we don't stop until we hit the trailhead. Nobody argued. Claire was sitting by the dead fire staring at nothing. Emma and Jordan were already stuffing sleeping bags into their packs with shaking hands. The camp was a disaster. Tents half collapsed, gear scattered, and everywhere those massive handprints in the soft earth. But it was what I saw at the edge of the clearing that made my blood run cold. During the night, they'd built something, a structure made of branches and logs, about 6 feet tall, woven together in a complex pattern that was definitely not natural, and hanging from it, tied with what looked like plant fibers, were offerings, a dead rabbit, fresh flowers, and something else that made my stomach turn. It was the lens cap from Silas's expensive camera, the one he'd been using yesterday at the outcropping half a mile away before we'd reached the tower. "They've been following us since yesterday morning," I said quietly. "Maybe longer, maybe since we entered the wilderness." Silas went pale. "That means they could have taken us at any point. They chose not to. Until we came here," Matthew added. "Until we invaded their territory." I thought about the old stories I'd heard, tales passed down by people who'd lived in these mountains for generations. The creatures, whatever they were, had rules, territories they defended, boundaries they enforced. We'd crossed one, maybe several, and they'd responded with a show of dominance. They'd proven they could kill us if they wanted to. But they'd stopped short. Was it mercy, intelligence, or just a different kind of cruelty? Letting us live with the memory, letting us spread the fear. "We need to go," I said. "Now." We made it half a mile before we realized we were being followed. There were no sounds, no obvious signs, but I could feel eyes on us, could sense movement in the trees paralleling our path. Every 50 yards or so, I'd catch a glimpse of brown fur between the trunks, always at the edge of vision, always just out of clear sight. They were hurting us. "Don't stop," I told the group. "Don't look behind you, just keep moving." Jordan was nearly running, half dragging Emma along. Claire had found some reserve of strength and kept pace with Matthew, who favored his injured shoulder but never slowed. Silas stayed close to me, his expensive camera forgotten in his desperate flight. We passed through areas where more structures had been built. Rock cairns stacked impossibly high, trees with bark stripped in spiral patterns, areas where every branch had been snapped at the same height, creating corridors through the forest. It was like walking through a gallery of territorial art, each piece a warning we'd ignored. 3 miles from the trailhead, we came to a stream crossing. The water was only knee-deep, running fast over smooth stones, but on the far bank, standing in the middle of the trail, was the big one.
We all froze.
It stood 8 feet tall in the morning light, its fur catching the sun in shades of brown and copper. Its face was turned toward us, and I could see details I'd missed in the darkness. The intelligent eyes, the almost human nose and mouth, the hands with opposable thumbs. It was both familiar and utterly alien, like looking at a distant cousin who'd taken a different evolutionary path. We stared at each other across the water for what felt like an eternity. Behind me, I could hear Emma's panicked breathing, Matthew's whispered prayers, Silas's camera clicking. He couldn't help himself, even now. Then the creature did something unexpected. It stepped off the trail, just moved to the side into the trees, and stood there watching us, waiting. "It's letting us go," Claire whispered. "It's letting us leave." "Don't look at it," I said. "Don't make eye contact, just walk. Slowly. Don't run." We crossed the stream in single file, water soaking our boots, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The creature watched us pass, close enough that I could smell that predator stench. Could hear its breathing deep and steady and completely controlled. As Matthew reached the far bank, the creature made a sound, not aggressive, not threatening, almost like a dismissal, a final warning. Then it turned and melted into the forest, moving with impossible silence for something so large. We didn't stop running until we saw Matthew's SUV at the trailhead. That was 3 weeks ago. I quit my job the next day. Didn't give notice, didn't explain, just told the company I was done guiding, packed my things and left. Matthew and Claire did the same with their hiking plans. Emma and Jordan canceled their wedding venue in the mountains and moved it to the coast. We all scattered, desperate to put distance between ourselves and those peaks. Only Silas stayed connected. He sent me an email last week with a photo attachment. It was one he'd taken during our escape, a telescopic shot of the creature on the trail. The image was perfectly clear, undeniable proof of something that wasn't supposed to exist. But the email wasn't about sharing evidence or going public. It was a confession. "I've been researching," he wrote. "The structures we saw, the territorial markers, they're consistent with hundreds of reports across the Appalachians. These things are everywhere, Leo. They've been here longer than we have. These mountains are theirs. We were the intruders. He ended with a question that keeps me awake at night. Do you think they let us go because we respected their warning, or because we were never really a threat? I don't have an answer. Sometimes late at night I hear that howl in my dreams, the one that climbs from the depths to a shriek that echoes off distant peaks. I wake up sweating, checking my windows, remembering those eyes watching us from the darkness. The Appalachian Mountains stretch for thousands of miles, wild and ancient and full of secrets we've spent centuries trying to ignore. We build our trails and our towers, convinced we've tamed the wilderness. But we haven't. We've just learned to pretend it's safe. I know the truth now. Deep in those mountains, in the places we rarely go, something else still lives. Something that was here first. Something that watches from the shadows and marks its territory and reminds us when we venture too far, when we forget our place, that we're not the apex predator we think we are. The mountains remember what we've forgotten. There are older rules out here, written long before we arrived, and breaking them comes with a price. I paid mine in fear and nightmares, and the loss of something I loved doing, but I got to walk away. Not everyone will be so lucky. If you're planning a trip to the deep Appalachians, listen to the old-timers, respect the warnings, watch for the signs, the structures, the markers, the impossible silence that falls when something is watching you. And if you see a handprint in the dirt too large to be human, if you hear howls that make your bones ache, if you feel eyes on you from the darkness between the trees, turn back. Don't test the boundaries. Don't make the same mistake I did, because next time they might not let you leave. I never believed the backwoods folklore, the whispered warnings around the campfire, until I saw it with my own eyes. My name is Jake Wilkins. I'm a park ranger in the remote wilderness of Olympic National Park, one of the most rugged and untamed corners left in the continental U.S. I took this job to escape from my past, from my demons, from the stress and trials of so-called civilized life. Out here, my little ranger cabin amid the towering firs and thick ferns is my sanctuary. Or so I thought. It started with scattered reports from spooked campers and hikers, eerie sensations of being watched from the tree line, strange rustling and snapping of branches late at night. A child swore she saw a hairy man-beast lurking in the shadows. I chalked it up to overactive imaginations and too many ghost stories around the fire. But then came the incident at Heart Lake. A family of 4, mom, dad, and 2 teenage kids, went out for a day hike and never came back. We mounted a search, combing miles of dense forest. As the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened on day 3, we found the campsite. The scene was something out of a slasher movie. Their tent shredded to ribbons. Gear and supplies scattered and smashed. Massive trough-like footprints sunken in the mud. Blood splattered on the torn nylon and forest loam. So much blood, but not a single body. The family had vanished into thin air. At the scene, I exchanged grim looks with my buddy Al, a grizzled ranger of 30 years. He met my eyes, slowly shook his head, and muttered a single word under his breath. The word that made my blood run cold: Dogman. Over bourbons in my cabin that night, Al told me the old legends in hushed tones, a beast that was neither man nor animal, but some twisted combination of the two, walking on 2 legs but covered in matted fur, with the head of a wolf and the hulking torso of a man, black, soulless eyes and jagged teeth, vicious, feral, driven by pure predatory instinct and malice. For generations, Dogman was said to stalk these woods, claiming the unlucky and unaware who ventured too far off trail. Parents used the threat of Dogman to frighten misbehaving children. Loggers and fur trappers spoke of the creature's blood-curdling howls echoing in the night. I always dismissed it as backwoods superstition. Until now. That poor family, mauled and dragged off into the wilderness to a fate I shudder to imagine. There was no rogue bear or roving pack of wolves that could tear apart a campsite like that. It had to be something unnatural. Officially, the Park Service listed them as missing, presumed dead. But I know the truth. And now it's become my sworn duty to hunt down this abomination they call Dogman before he kills again, even if it means descending into my own heart of darkness. Little did I know the nightmares that awaited me in the shadows of the forest I once called home. In the weeks after the Heart Lake incident, an eerie hush fell over the park, like nature herself was holding her breath. No birds singing at dawn, no elk boogling in the misty valleys, just oppressive, watchful silence. I threw myself into the hunt, spending days scouring the dense underbrush for any trace of the elusive creature. I studied the old reports, pored over yellowed newspaper clippings in the basement archive. Al and I interviewed the elders of the local Quilu tribe, who spoke of an ancient legend, a curse placed upon a man who dared hunt on their sacred ground. a man who slowly merged with the spirit of the wolf until neither half could be distinguished. Some of the other rangers just shook their heads when I spoke of Dogman, dismissing it as the ravings of a guilty mind. They accused me of concocting beasts to absolve myself of failing that poor family. Only Al stood by my side, the two of us against a wilderness full of skeptics and shadows. But I couldn't shake the memories of that shredded campsite, or the claw marks gouged into the bark of a nearby tree, too deep and savage to be from any bear. I swear I felt its eyes upon me wherever I hiked, something malevolent and unholy watching from the shadows between the pines. I barely slept anymore, jolting awake to the slightest creak outside the cabin, always with my rifle within arm's reach. Then came the night that removed all doubt. It was a rare evening off, and I headed into the tiny logging town of Forks to restock supplies and fortify myself with a few drinks at the local watering hole. I noticed the stares and furtive whispers from the townfolk when I entered. News travels fast in these isolated outposts. No doubt many of them thought the ranger had gone off the deep end, unhinged by guilt. If only they knew the truth. I was 3 bourbons deep when a lone figure sidled up to me at the bar, a man in his 60s, with weathered, sunken eyes and a wild thatch of beard. He introduced himself only as Tobias, spoke with the clipped, guttural accent of a Russian expat. "I hear you are looking for Dogman," he said quietly, casting a careful glance around the bar. "I hear you want to know truth." I studied him for a long moment. Something about his intense gaze unnerved me deeply, as if he could see right through to my troubled soul. But the alcohol had bolstered my courage. "What do you know, old-timer? I need all the help I can get." He glanced around again and dropped his voice to a whisper. "Is not just legend, not tall tale. Dogman is real." He made a strange sign with his fingers, as if warding off evil. "I know because I see with own eyes. Many years ago." He told a halting but haunting account. How he was camping with friends many years ago in a remote corner of the park. How they were stalked in the darkness for 2 terrifying nights. How his friend Mikhail ventured from the safety of the RV to relieve himself, only to scream for help as he was dragged into the night by a massive fur-covered hand. By the time they found his body, it had been ravaged almost beyond recognition. "You watch for human eyes," Tobias rasped, boring into me with his haunted stare. "His only way to know. Human eyes in animal face. Then you know it is Dogman." A shiver ran through me, icy even in the warm din of the tavern. All I could see were the faces of that poor family that went missing. The family I failed. How do I stop it? I managed to croak. How do I kill it? "You do not. You cannot," Tobias muttered gravely. "Dogman cannot be stopped, only survived. You stay out of deep woods, you leave this place, is best advice I give." With that, he downed his vodka in a single swig, placed a commiserating hand on my shoulder and melted away into the crowd, leaving me more shaken and confused than ever. But one thing I knew for sure, I couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after what I'd seen. What I knew lurked out there in the wilderness I'd sworn to protect. I had to confront this demon, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Even if it meant never coming back. I don't know how long I sat there nursing my bourbon after Tobias's dire warning, turning his words over and over in my increasingly fuzzy mind. The few other patrons gave me a wide berth, casting concerned glances at the unhinged ranger muttering to himself in the corner. The bartender gently suggested I call a ride, but I waved him off. There was no rest for me tonight, not with the wheels spinning wildly in my head. I stumbled from the bar into the cool night air, finding my trusty pickup in the gravel lot. The drive back to the ranger station passed in a numb blur. Tobias's story played in my mind's eye on a maddening loop, the vicious snarls and screams of his doomed friends echoing between my ears. How could this beast have stalked the forests for so long? Why had nobody managed to hunt it down, to put an end to its reign of terror? The questions raced through my mind faster than I could register them, let alone summon any answers. Passing the darkened windows of the station, I parked behind my cabin and fumbled for my keys with trembling hands. In my haste, they slipped from my fingers into the dirt. I crouched to search for them in the dark, and froze. There, clearly impressed in the loose soil beside my front step, was a footprint. But no boot or shoe print, no meandering nocturnal creature. It was a trough of a print, nearly 2 feet long and sunken deeply into the earth as if made by a massive weight. Toes splayed at the front, fringed by claw marks, definitely bipedal, but warped and misshapen in a way that sent ancient instinctive alarm bells ringing in the darkest reaches of my mind. The same eerie loping gait as the tracks we found at the Heart Lake campsite. I glanced wildly around, my drunk, clumsy hands fumbling at the holster on my belt. But the night was still. The only sound the panicked huffing of my breath and the bass drum pounding of my heart. With a white-knuckle grip on my sidearm, I shouldered open my door, snatched my flashlight from the end table, and swept the beam across the one-room cabin with the muzzle of my gun. Nothing seemed out of place, no sign of disturbance beyond my own half-unpacked luggage and weeks-old unwashed dishes. But pinned to the sheet of my unmade bed was an oblong scrap of fur. With trembling fingers, I plucked it from the rumpled cotton. The strands were coarse and oily between my fingers, matted with mud and debris. It was like no fur I had ever seen or felt before. Not deer, not elk, not bear, not coyote or mountain lion. The closest thing my addled brain could compare it to was wolf. But impossibly thick, pungent with a nauseating musk. I swear the rank feral stench of wet animal still hung heavy in the air. Dogman had been here, inside my most personal sanctum. He had stood over the bed where I tossed and turned in tortured dreams. Violent primal revulsion shuddered through my body, and I stumbled to the door, leaning out to vomit my cheap bourbon into the dirt. I wiped my mouth with a clammy hand, staring into the night with wild eyes. The message was clear as day. I was being hunted now. The hunter had become the hunted. I had stared too long into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, found me, marked me. It could have torn me to bloody shreds right here in my bed, but it chose not to, because I realized with sickening clarity this was a game to it. Cat and mouse, predator and prey. A cruel, taunting reminder that I wasn't safe anywhere. Not in the forest, not in my cabin, nowhere. No use calling for backup. Even if they believed me, they'd be lambs to the slaughter. More blood on my hands. No, this was my cross to bear. My curse. My penance. I splashed icy water on my face, grabbed my go bag and my rifle. Almost as an afterthought, I snatched the grimy tuft of fur, stuffing it into a pocket as a grim reminder. With one last look at the four walls that had been my safe haven these past months, I steeled myself and plunged into the waiting dark of the forest. If Dogman wanted to hunt me, so be it. I'd become the most dangerous game, and I wouldn't stop until one of us was in the ground. The forest enveloped me like the waiting gullet of some colossal beast, the night pressing in from all sides. The bobbing beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the swimming darkness. I slipped between the looming trunks, boots crunching softly on the dense carpet of pine needles. High above, the canopy swayed and creaked in the breeze, blotting out all but a few mocking stars. I hadn't gone more than a mile before I sensed it. That shivery, hair-raising feeling of being observed by unseen eyes. Every snapping twig, every rasp of leaves, made my head whip around, my heart leap into my throat. Was it my whiskey-soaked paranoia? Or was Dogman already on my trail, ghosting through the shadows, watching and waiting? A sudden gust moaned through the treetops, setting the needles to hissing like 1,000 serpents. I whirled, raising my rifle, but only blackness stared back. I was just about to lower the gun when I heard it. A long, low howl, ululating up and down the scale. It echoed through the trees, impossible to pinpoint, as if it came from every direction at once. The plaintive, haunting cry sent icy prickles marching down my spine. It was a sound of pure ferocity, edged with an almost human malevolence. I froze, listening hard, pulse pounding in my ears. Silence descended once more. The howl didn't come again. Maybe my shot nerves had conjured it. Maybe my shot nerves had conjured it. A branch cracked like a gunshot to my left, and I spun, sighting down the barrel into the swimming dark. There, caught in the edge of my bobbing flashlight beam, a pair of eyes. Round, reflective, glowing a spectral green in the thrown light. Too large for a coyote, too intelligent for a bear. They stared with a shocking intensity, unblinking, from the shadows between two monumental pines. I swallowed hard past my hammering heart, my finger curling around the trigger. For an eternal moment I was frozen in that otherworldly stare, pinned like an insect beneath the eyes of something ancient and inhuman and unutterably savage. Then the eyes blinked once and vanished, shaking. I advanced on the spot, sweeping my light across the ferns. No trace, just the sighing of the wind and the faint groaning of timber. That's when I noticed the smell on the night breeze. The same gamey wet dog musk that had choked my cabin. It was here, inches away, toying with me. The forest blurred around me, my pulse pounding in my head, my grip slick with cold sweat on the rifle stock. I swiped the beam back and forth, peering into every pool of shadow. My nerve was quickly unraveling. I spun in a circle, overwhelmed by the walls of darkness crushing in from every direction. It could be anywhere, watching from the impenetrable gloom, waiting for its moment to strike. A blood-curdling roar shattered the night directly behind me. So close I felt the heat of its breath. I screamed, whirling blindly, pulling the trigger. The rifle jerked and barked. muzzle flash lighting up a horrid glimpse, a gaping maw, a bristling pelt, swiping claws. I scrambled backward, tripping over a rotted log, my gun flying from my hand. I scrabbled on my back, gasping, expecting to feel hot fangs sinking into my flesh at any second. But there was only stillness. The echo of my shot faded away. The stench of gunpowder mingled with that feral animal reek. Sobbing for breath, I pawed for my flashlight, probing the underbrush with the wavering beam. There, splattered across the waxy leaves of a salal bush, glistening darkly in the light blood, I'd hit the thing, winged it at least, but it had vanished into the night as suddenly as it appeared, melted back into the shadows like a phantom. I scrambled to my feet, snatching up my rifle with violently shaking hands. A saner man would have taken this momentary reprieve and ran, fled back to the station, tail between his legs, and tried to convince himself it was all a liquor-fueled nightmare. But I was far past the point of sanity. Call it courage, call it stupidity, call it the stubborn pride of a man with something to prove. I had to finish this. I plunged into the underbrush, following the trail of blood spatters and broken twigs. The creature's bulk had left a wrecked swath through the dense foliage, not difficult to track even for a rookie scout. It was wounded, maybe slowed. For the first time I felt a surge of grim hope, but as I crashed through the brush I slowly became aware of a change in the night. The intermittent blood trail grew fainter, then vanished altogether, and the creature's path seemed to shift, double back and meander, twisting in nonsensical patterns, almost as if it knew I would follow, almost as if I blundered from the brush into a small clearing and pulled up short, the breath freezing in my lungs. There, across the open space, crouched a dark, hulking shape. A pair of lantern eyes flashed in my beam, staring me down. Blood matted the fur of one massive shoulder. Dogman rose slowly to its full, towering height, well over 7 feet. I should have been terrified, but my veins sang with a kind of surging, reckless bloodlust. I raised my rifle, sighted on that barrel chest. This was my chance. This was what I'd been waiting for. Come on then, you bastard. I heard myself growl through gritted teeth. Let's finish this. I squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked the night, and missed wildly as the creature lunged to the side with startling speed. I fired again, but it was on me in an instant, a terrifying blur of matted fur and flashing teeth. A massive paw swiped and sent my rifle spinning into the brush. Another slammed me to the ground, claws raking my chest. Hot, reeking breath blasted my face, jaws slavering inches from my throat. This was it. This was the end. But the jaws never closed. The beast just crouched there, pinning me, one giant paw crushing my sternum. It hesitated, and as I stared in horror into that twisted face, I saw what Tobias had warned me of. Those hideous features, stuck halfway between wolf and man, and the eyes, not animal eyes, not the eyes of a rabid beast, intelligent eyes, human eyes, boring into me from that grotesque face, filled with an utterly human anguish. In that suspended moment, I saw something flicker in those tortured eyes, something like recognition, sorrow, longing. Then it shuddered and shook its shaggy head as if to dislodge a fly. The spell was broken. It lunged for my neck, fangs flashing. I scrabbled desperately in the dirt, fingers closing on a rock. With a wild yell, I smashed the stone against its snout. Dogman reeled back with a pained yelp, pawing at its bloodied muzzle. I took my chance and ran, crashing blindly into the brush, thorns tearing at my face and arms. I ran until the breath seared my lungs and my legs gave out, sending me sprawling into the carpet of rot and humus. I lay there gasping, feeling the sticky warmth of my own blood seeping through my tattered shirt. Everything ached. Hopelessness crashed over me in a suffocating wave. What was I doing? I couldn't stop this thing. I was just a man, lost and small and fragile in this immense, uncaring wilderness. Then I remembered that momentary flicker in the beast's eyes, that impossible hint of humanity. What did it mean? My exhausted mind shied away from the implications, too horrific to comprehend. All I knew was this: I couldn't do this alone. I needed help, no matter the cost to my pride. I needed answers. I hauled myself to my feet with a groan and started the long, limping trek back to civilization, back to the only person who might just believe me. I had to find Tobias before Dogman found me again. I don't remember the ragged hike back to my cabin. I must have stumbled through the night in a daze, running on pure autopilot. By the time I shouldered through my door, pale fingers of dawn light were already creeping through the pines. It felt like a lifetime ago that I'd charged into the forest, drunk on adrenaline and misplaced bravado. Now I just felt hollowed out, defeated. I stripped off the tattered, blood-stained remains of my uniform with unsteady hands. My wounds had mostly clotted, the gouges not as deep as I'd first feared. Small mercies. I did my best to clean and bandage them, wincing as the antiseptic burned in the jagged claw marks. Then I collapsed onto my bed and fell into a black, dreamless abyss. When I jolted awake, unsure if I'd slept for hours or days, my first thought was to call Al. What would I even say? That I'd shot and brawled with a mythical beast, that I'd seen something unspeakably human in its eyes. He'd think I'd gone well and truly around the bend. I had no proof beyond my ravaged flesh. No, I was on my own. Tobias's weathered face swam into my sleep-fogged mind. The strange old Russian knew more than he let on. He was the key. I had to find him, convince him to share what he knew before Dogman found me exposed and vulnerable. I hauled my aching body vertical with a groan, fumbling for a relatively clean ranger shirt. I was just shrugging painfully into it when something on the floor caught my eye, something that made my heart seize in my chest. Muddy paw prints. Massive and unmistakable, trailing from the door to the edge of my bed. I whipped around wildly, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. But the cabin was silent, the prints already dry. Dogman had found me again, tracked me here, watched me sleep. I couldn't help but picture it, that hulking shape looming over my exhausted body, yet still showing that awful, inexplicable restraint. Bile surged up my throat. Then I saw it, atop my rumpled bedsheets, glaringly out of place, a crude circle of twigs and moss. And in the center, a jagged gray rock, flecked with rust-colored stains. The same rock I'd smashed into the creature's muzzle. My blood and its blood mingled together. Some primitive instinctual part of my brain recoiled at the sight, recognizing the profane symbolism even as my rational mind struggled to comprehend. A threat? A warning? Or something more alien, more unthinkable? A gift? I backed away from the grim tableau, snatching up my car keys, my hand already dialing Al's number on reflex. But I froze before hitting call. No, this was beyond the ranger service, beyond anything I could rationally explain or expect them to believe. This was my burden, my curse. I left the cabin without a backward glance, throwing myself behind the wheel of my pickup. The old logging roads flew by in a blur beneath my wheels as I sped for Forks, for the dim wood-paneled tavern where I'd first met my only hope for answers. Tobias wasn't hard to find. He was tucked into the same corner table as last time, nursing the same ambiguous clear liquid. He looked up as I crossed the sticky floor toward him, something like weary resignation in his eyes, as if he'd known I'd come. I saw it, I said without preamble, dropping into the chair opposite him with a wince for my battered body. I fought it. He absorbed this with a slow nod, taking a thoughtful sip from his smudged glass. He didn't seem surprised, or particularly concerned for my ragged state. "You are lucky to be alive," he said finally, his tone flat. "Most who see Dogman do not return. It could have killed me. It had every chance. But it didn't." I swallowed hard, my voice dropping to an urgent near whisper. I looked in its eyes, Tobias. I saw something human. He went very still at that, setting down his glass with a dull clink. Even in the dim light of the bar, I saw a shadow pass over his careworn features. "Duh, I know." "You know?" I stared at him, my pulse picking up. "What do you mean you know? What the hell is that thing out there?" He glanced around the nearly empty bar, then leaned across the table toward me. When he spoke again, his voice was so low I had to strain to hear it over the tinny jukebox. "Is not a thing, is a who." I just stared blankly, uncomprehending. Tobias sighed, something bleak and haunted in his eyes. "The man I tell you about, McCoyle. The one who was taken. He was not just friend." He looked away, jaw working. "He was my brother." An icy tendril of dread uncoiled in my gut as the implication slowly sank in. I shook my head, trying to reject the impossible idea taking shape. "Tobias, what are you saying?" He refocused on me, his gaze sharp and pained. "Mikhail is Dogman, my brother. He's still alive." I sat there staring at Tobias in mute shock, my mind reeling as I tried to process his devastating revelation. Mikhail, his brother, was Dogman. The thing I'd been hunting, the thing that had killed that poor family, the thing that had stalked and pounced and nearly torn me to shreds. A person. That's a... Tobias reached into his jacket, drawing out a battered silver hip flask. He uncapped it and took a long pull, eyeing me steadily over the tarnished rim. "There are older, stranger things in these woods than most know. Dangerous things." He tapped the flask meaningfully. Mikhail, he was always too curious for his own good, too brave, too foolish. He proceeded to unspool a halting tale, his voice low and raw with old grief. How he and Mikhail, young and heedless, had gone camping all those years ago in the deep woods. ignorant of the ancient warnings. How they had stumbled upon an old site, a ring of standing stones hidden in the wilderness. How Mikhail, ever the headstrong one, had ignored Tobias's pleas and ventured into the circle on a fool's dare. The place, it was wrong, cold. Even the birds did not sing, Tobias murmured, his unfocused gaze lost in the swirling depths of his flask. And the stones, they were marked, with symbols no man should know. That night, camped beneath those whispering trees, Mikhail had woken Tobias with his screaming. He was feverish, drenched in sweat, clawing at his skin as if it burned him. He raved about visions, night terrors, things moving in the darkness. And as Tobias looked on in horror, unable to help, his brother had begun to change. It was slow. Tortured, bones breaking, reshaping, hair growing, teeth shifting. Tobias knocked back another swig, as if the act of remembering it physically pained him. By morning, my brother, he was not my brother. He was beast, monster. Tobias had fled those woods, left Mikhail to his fate, too frightened and ashamed to tell a soul. In the months that followed, the disappearances started. The sightings, the whispers of a creature stalking the forest. Neither man nor animal. That was when Tobias knew his cowardice had doomed more than just his brother. I tried to find him later, to bring him back. But you cannot find Dogman, he said bitterly. Dogman finds you. He looked up at me then, his eyes burning with a sudden desperate intensity. He reached across the table, gripping my arm with startling strength. But you, he let you live. He left you message. His fingers dug into my sleeve, urgent. Don't you see, there is still human in him, still Mikhail. You can reach him. I pulled back, my head swimming, struggling to absorb the enormity of it all. Werewolves, ancient curses. It was like something out of a midnight horror movie. But I couldn't deny what I'd seen in those tortured, uncannily human eyes. What I'd felt in that extended, charged moment when the beast had held my life in its jaws and chosen, inexplicably, to spare it. Could it be true? Could there still be some shred of humanity left in that monstrous form? And if so, was I meant to save it? My thoughts flashed to the grim tableau left on my bed. The dark symbolism of blood and mossy tokens. An invitation. A cry for help. I couldn't be sure, but I knew with grim certainty that I was now bound to this creature. For better or worse, its fate had become entwined with mine. I met Tobias's desperate, pleading gaze, feeling the weight of an impossible task settle heavily on my shoulders. What do? I asked softly. All traces of my former cocky bluster evaporated. How do I even begin to save him? Tobias released his grip on my arm, something like hope warring with the ghosts in his eyes. You must return to place where it began. The circle. I can show you. He leaned forward intently. But you must be one to reach him, to call to human within beast. I swallowed hard, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into a yawning abyss of unknown terrors. But I'd come too far to turn back now. I owed it to the family I'd failed, to the people I'd sworn to protect as a ranger, and maybe in some strange way, I owed it to Mikhail. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Okay, show me. Night had fallen by the time Tobias led me, through winding back roads and overgrown game trails, to that ancient circle of stones hidden deep in the forest. They rose from the dense foliage like jagged teeth, the moss-slick symbols carved into their flanks seeming to writhe in the play of our flashlight beams. The air felt different here, heavy and watchful, charged with a sense of wrong that prickled the hair on my nape and set my teeth on edge. I turned to Tobias, but he was already backing away, his lined face pale and tight with dread. I can go no further, he said, an apology and a plea all in one. This place, it is not for me, not anymore. He hesitated, then reached out to clasp my shoulder, his grip fierce. Save my brother, please, bring him back to me. Then he was gone, melting back into the shadows, leaving me alone in that ill-omened glade. I stood there for a long moment, the night pressing in like a smothering weight, my heart a trapped bird beating frantically against my ribs. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to flee this cursed place and never look back. But I thought of Dogman, of Mikhail, of that fragment of humanity trapped within a prison of fangs and claws. Steeling myself, I stepped into the circle. The temperature plummeted, my breath pluming before me. The stones seemed to loom, to pulse with a fell energy. It felt like sacrilege, like trespassing on ground not meant for mortal feet. But I forced myself to stand fast, turning a slow circle within the ring. It was time to call to the man within the beast. It was time to end this, one way or another. Mikhail, I shouted, my voice cracking, swallowed by the immense night. Mikhail, I know you're here. I know you can hear me. Only silence answered. The sighing of wind through branches. I tried again, desperation pitching my words high and thready. I know what happened to you, what this place did. But your brother sent me, Mikhail, Tobias. He wants you to come home. A twig snapped in the underbrush, and I whirled, heart in my throat. There, at the edge of the tree line, a shadow detached itself from the greater darkness. Dogman slunk into the open, head low, hackles raised. Its eyes glowed in the moonlight, fixed unwaveringly on me. I raised my shaking hands, palms out, fighting every urge to turn and run. Mikhail, I said softly, holding that feral gaze, I know you're in there. You don't have to do this anymore. You can come back. A growl rumbled deep in its chest, but it didn't pounce, didn't attack. It began to pace the perimeter of the circle, never taking its eyes off me. I matched it step for step, maintaining the distance between us. This isn't you, it wasn't your fault, what happened, but you can fight it. I thought of the family, of the lives lost, and my voice broke. Please, no more killing, no more blood. At the word blood, Dogman flinched as if struck, a high whine escaping its throat. It shook its great shaggy head, pawing at its muzzle almost anxiously. I latched onto that, hope flaring in my chest. You remember them, don't you? The people you've hurt. You never wanted this. I risked a step forward, then another, my hand outstretched. Tobias is waiting for you, your brother. He wants to help you. Dogman froze, going utterly still. For a long, suspended moment it stared at me, through me, with those uncannily human eyes. Then slowly, incredibly, it sank back on its haunches, head bowed, shoulders slumping, as if in surrender. I approached cautiously, hardly daring to breathe. I sank to my knees before the creature, close enough now to feel the heat of its breath, the tension coiled in its mighty frame. With a trembling hand, I reached out and laid my palm on the matted fur of its bowed head. Come back, Mikhail, I whispered. Come back to us. For an instant, I felt the beast shudder beneath my touch. Then the air seemed to ripple, to shimmer with an otherworldly energy. I snatched my hand back, scrambling away, as Dogman threw back its head and loosed an unearthly howl that sent every hair on my body standing erect. The change, when it came, was fluid and instantaneous. Not the slow, agonizing transformation Tobias had described, but a blink and you'll miss it shift. One moment, a hulking beast crouched before me. The next, a man, naked, shivering, curled in on himself like a child. I stared, shock robbing me of words, of movement. The man raised his head slowly, blinking as if waking from a long, terrible dream. His eyes met mine, and they were just eyes, human eyes, filled with confusion and dawning horror. What happened? He croaked, his voice rusted from disuse. Where am I? Who are you? I shrugged out of my jacket, draping it gently around his trembling shoulders. It's okay, I said, though I knew it was anything but. It's over now, you're safe. I coaxed Mikhail to his feet, supporting his weight as he stumbled. I had no idea what would come next, how I would explain any of this, how Mikhail would begin to cope with the horrors he'd wrought. But as I led him out of that cursed circle, toward the distant light of civilization, I felt a burden lift from my shoulders. I had started this hunt as a mission of vengeance, of eradication. But somewhere along the way, it had become something more, a quest for redemption, both for the man trapped within the beast, and perhaps for myself as well. The road ahead would be long and hard. I knew. The scars left by Dogman ran deep, both on the land and on our souls. But for the first time in my long nights of terror, I dared to hope that healing might be possible. That even the darkest of curses could be broken if only we had the courage to reach for the humanity buried within the monster, to face our demons and finally set them free. I became a park ranger because I needed a steady paycheck and I loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, I spent most of my free time hiking, camping, and exploring the vast forests that surrounded us. My parents didn't have much money, but they taught me to appreciate the simple things, a scenic overlook, a hidden waterfall, the wonder of nature. After high school, I knew I wanted a job that would let me spend my days immersed in the wilderness. But with college tuition costs rising and my family's limited means, I had to be practical. I got an associate's degree in environmental science from the local community college while working part-time jobs to pay my bills. I applied to every park ranger opening in the tri-state area. After dozens of rejections, I finally got an offer from a national forest way out in Montana, Kootenai National Forest, over 1 million remote acres right by the Canadian border. It was entry-level and seasonal, just for the summer months, but it came with housing and a small stipend. I'd never been out west before, but I figured now was my chance for an adventure, to escape my sleepy hometown for a while. I arrived at my post deep in the back country in early May, just as the winter snow was beginning to melt in the high country. My supervisor, John, a gruff 50-something who'd been a ranger his whole career, picked me up in an old Forest Service truck. As we bounced along a rutted dirt road, him behind the wheel and me in the passenger seat, he gave me the lay of the land. We cover the northern district. That's about 400,000 acres, mostly designated wilderness. Lot of hikers and backpackers in the summer, occasional hunter in the fall. Winter, it's just the diehards, a few backcountry skiers and snowshoers. Any wildlife issues? I asked, thinking of bears and mountain lions. John snorted. The usual miners, moose, elk, deer, some predators. They ain't the problem. It's the two-legged animals that'll get you in trouble. He didn't elaborate and I didn't press him. I spent the first few weeks learning the ropes from John and the other summer seasonal, a college kid named Tyler. We maintained trails, cleaned out fire pits, and kept an eye out for careless campers as the forest grew busy. It was hard but satisfying work, and I loved every minute of it. The soaring mountains, the smell of pine, the alpine glow on the peaks at sunset, it filled my soul in a way I'd never experienced before. This was what I was meant to do. But as the summer wore on, I started to notice some odd things. Campers would report strange sounds outside their tents at night. Eerie howls that didn't quite sound like any animal we had around. Food began to go missing from bear bags strung up in the trees, even when they were hung correctly. And I started to get a creeping feeling, as I hiked alone through the dense timber, that I was being watched. I mentioned it to John one evening, as we sat around the fire pit outside the ranger cabin where I bunked. He took a swig of whiskey and stared into the flames for a long moment before responding. "You're not imagining it," he finally said. "There's something out there, something that ain't..." A shiver ran up my spine despite the warmth of the fire. "What do you mean? Like Bigfoot?" John barked out a laugh. "Bigfoot? I wish. No, this is something different, something worse." He proceeded to tell me about the legend of the Dog Man, a creature that was half man, half beast, with the body of a man but the head of a wolf or wild dog. It walked on two legs but ran on all fours, faster than any human, and it had a taste for human flesh. "That's just an old campfire story," I said, trying to sound dismissive even as goosebumps prickled my arms. Growing up in Pennsylvania, I'd heard my share of silly folklore and urban legends. The Jersey Devil, the Mothman, the Bunny Man. They were good for a scare, but I didn't actually believe in them. "Plenty of people who've encountered it would beg to differ," John replied darkly, "though most don't live to tell about it." He shared a few stories he claimed were true. A group of Girl Scouts who vanished on a backpacking trip in the 80s, leaving behind only shredded sleeping bags and a camera with a single blurry photo of something emerging from the tree line. A fire lookout who radioed in a panicked report of a wolf walking like a man before his tower was found abandoned. A hiker who stumbled out of the woods after being missing for days, covered in gashes and rambling about a dog-headed demon. By the time John finished, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up and I had a cold sweat between my shoulder blades, even though the rational part of my brain still insisted it had to be nonsense. When I retired to my bunk, I double-checked the locks on the windows and door, but I hardly slept a wink. The next few weeks passed without incident, and I chalked John's stories up to an old ranger's overactive imagination after one too many grisly search and rescue missions. It was easy to let your mind play tricks on you out in the wilderness. Then, in early August, we got word that a family of 4, mom, dad, and 2 elementary-age kids, had failed to return from an overnight backpacking trip to some alpine lakes. It wasn't uncommon for people to get turned around on the trails up here, but after 24 hours with no sign of them, we had to mount a search. John, Tyler, and I split up to cover more ground, taking different approaches to the lakes. As I trekked through dense underbrush and across chilly creeks rushing with snowmelt, the sky darkened and the wind picked up. An unseasonal storm was blowing in. By the time I reached the first lake, I could barely see through the pelting rain. I searched the perimeter, calling out for the family and keeping an eye out for their bright tent, to no avail. The looming spruces swayed ominously, and sheets of rain obscured my headlamp beam. My radio crackled. No luck for John or Tyler either. With darkness falling and the weather worsening, I had no choice but to make camp for the night and resume at first light. I pitched my tent on the least soggy patch of ground I could find, then crawled inside and tried to warm up and dry off enough to catch a few hours of fitful sleep. Sometime later, I jolted awake, unsure what had disturbed me. I lay still in my sleeping bag, ears straining in the pattering darkness. The storm had died down, but the forest was filled with the normal, innocuous noises of nature at night. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. Then I heard it, a sound that sent ice water flooding my veins. The unmistakable thud-thud-thud of heavy, lumbering footsteps right outside my tent. They paced back and forth, circling me like a predator toying with its prey. Not the soft pad of a bear or mountain lion, something bigger, something walking on two legs. My mind raced with the stories John had told me. It couldn't be, it had to be my sleepless mind conjuring fantasies. But then came another sound that froze my blood. A deep, guttural growl that was neither human nor animal. A rank, musky stench filled the air, turning my stomach. I fumbled for my lantern with shaking hands, my breath rasping in my throat. Mustering my last scrap of courage, I unzipped the tent flap and thrust the light out into the murky night, praying I would see only an empty campsite. But the beam fell upon a hulking figure mere yards away, illuminating it in starkly shadowed relief. It was vaguely man-shaped, but larger, with a barrel chest and muscular arms that hung nearly to the ground. Matted fur dripped from its nakedness, glistening in the lantern light. And the head, oh God, the head. Not human, not canine, but some chimerical merging of the two, a protruding snout full of jagged teeth below glowing yellow eyes that fixed hungrily on me. The creature threw its head back in an ear-splitting howl, then dropped to all fours, now unmistakably a beast, and sprang toward me with preternatural speed and grace. A scream tore from my throat as I scrabbled backwards and fumbled for the bear spray at my belt. Too slow, too late. In an instant it was upon me, all hot breath and slashing claws and snapping jaws. White-hot pain seared across my chest as talons raked my flesh. The lantern flew from my grip and winked out, plunging us into blackness that pulsed red with my own blood. I flailed wildly in the dark, kicking and punching at yielding flesh, trying in vain to scramble away. But an impossibly strong paw pinned me down like a mouse under a cat's claw. As the other paw closed around my throat, claws sinking into my neck, and squeezed. As I felt the life being throttled out of me, my oxygen-starved brain detached from the searing agony of the moment. So this was how it would end. My dream job become a nightmare, my body left broken and bloodied for the crows to pick over, a mysterious disappearance that would haunt my family forever. Just as my vision narrowed to a pinpoint, the pressure suddenly vanished from my windpipe. The creature uttered a startled yelp. In the darkness, I heard the unmistakable thunk of something hollow impacting flesh and bone. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th thunk, the beast crashed to the ground beside me with a wheezing gurgle. "What the hell?" a familiar voice cried. The beam of a flashlight cut through the night and fell on me, in my shredded, blood-soaked sleeping bag. It was Tyler, a sturdy branch still clutched in his hands, his face ashen. A few feet away lay the still form of the creature that had been inches from ripping out my throat. "Oh my God, are you, is it?" Tyler could scarcely get the words out, his eyes darting between my ravaged body and the beast that had wrought the damage. He had been approaching my campsite for a midnight rendezvous, when he heard my screams and charged in blindly, acting on instinct. "I think so." I croaked through my bruised larynx, probing my wounds with shock-numbed fingers. "Thanks to you." I tried to sit up and nearly passed out from the searing pain across my chest and back. "Don't move," Tyler ordered. "I'm calling for help." With one eye still on the motionless creature, he grabbed his radio and began barking our coordinates to the ranger station. As we waited for the salvation of sirens and stretchers, I marveled that I was still breathing. But I knew, without a doubt, that the thing lying a few feet away was no mere animal, no trick of my mind, and I knew my life would never be the same. I spent a week in the hospital downstate, stitched up and sedated as infection raged beneath the hash marks of gauze. The official story was a grisly attack, but Tyler and I knew the truth. When I was released, I went straight to the ranger station to confront John. I found him on the porch staring out at the sea of dark timber with a 1,000-yard stare, an untouched mug of coffee at his elbow. He didn't look surprised to see me. "You knew," I said, my voice hoarse and laced with betrayal. "You knew that thing was out there and you didn't warn us." John's face pinched, but he didn't deny it. "Would you have believed me if I had?" The worst part was that he was right. I'd laughed off his stories, chalked them up to backwoods superstition, even as the evidence mounted before my eyes, and it had nearly gotten me killed. "What is it?" I asked, slumping into the adjacent chair with a wince as my stitches pulled. "Some genetic experiment gone wrong? An extraterrestrial? The goddamn dog man." John barked a mirthless laugh. "Your guess is as good as mine, kid. All I know is it's been stalking these woods since before I started wearing this uniform. Taking people, hikers mostly, but a few rangers over the years too." My blood ran cold at the implication. "Others? Why haven't I heard about this? There should have been manhunts, media frenzies." He gave me a look that was almost pitying. You think the Forest Service wants that kind of publicity? Best case, we're a laughingstock accused of perpetuating hoaxes and hysteria. Worst case, it's bad for tourism. His mouth twisted. Nah, they cover it up every time. Say it's a rogue bear, or exposure, or a hiker that just vanished. Anger flared in my gut, as hot as my wounds. So they just let it keep happening? Let people keep dying? No one's let anything happen, John snapped. We've tried to hunt it more times than I can count. Set traps, tracked it for days. But it's too smart, too fast, and it knows this territory better than any of us. These are its woods, not ours. I thought of the creature's preternatural speed and strength, the calculating malice and hunger in its eyes. I knew with sinking certainty that John was right. This was no mere animal. We were outmatched. But as I fingered the stitches mapping my chest, I also knew I couldn't just walk away. I'd seen the face of evil, and now I wouldn't rest until it was dead, and I had answers. So I spent months researching everything I could dig up on dogmen and their kin, skinwalkers, lycanthropes, wendigos. I combed message boards and obscure subreddits, emailed paranormal investigators, even traveled to indigenous reservations to hear the ancient legends straight from tribal elders. Everywhere I turned, I found stories that echoed my own, and nowhere did I find a solution. As I struggled to reconcile the uncanny with my rational worldview, the summer drew to a close. Tyler finished his seasonal stint and went back to school. John put in for early retirement as if a pension and a gold watch would keep him safe. And I changed, adapted, hardened. I renewed my backcountry EMT cert and buffed up my wilderness survival skills. I began carrying a high-powered hunting rifle in addition to my standard-issue sidearm. I moved from my shared ranger cabin to a small lookout tower of my own, where I could keep watch over my forest. Because the one thing I knew for certain was that the creature was still out there, waiting, watching, hungry. I'd gotten lucky, next time I might not. But now I had a mission: protect the civilians in my care, and find a way to stop this thing once and for all. Little did I know that my mission would lead me into darker woods than I could possibly imagine. Fall in northwest Montana had gilded my domain in gold and amber. But when winter came, the forest turned hungry, feral, frigid. The usual two-legged tourists trickled to almost none. The trails empty but for the occasional hardcore backcountry skier. The world slept beneath a quilt of white. But I knew better than to let down my guard. If anything, the beast would be more desperate, more reckless in the icy wilds. As I ranged over the snow-swept timberline, my senses stayed on high alert, attuned to every snap of a twig, each out-of-place shadow. I'd taken to spending long hours in my lookout tower, an eagle's eyrie with 360 views of my territory. On clear nights, I'd sit bundled beneath an electric blanket, peering through a starlight scope, a thermos of black coffee going cold beside me, watching, waiting for a hulking silhouette against the snowdrifts, a telltale parabolic pair of eyeshine glowing in the dark, for another chance to end this. Call it luck, intuition, or the honed senses of a predator recognizing one of its own kind. But on a brilliantly moonlit night in late January, I finally caught a glimpse of my quarry's return. A mere suggestion of a shadow flowing between skeletal trees, there and gone again in a blink. A rumor of sulphurous musk hanging in the air among the pine sol of cedar and spruce. The faintest of tremors through my scope as something large moved, deeper in the timber. My blood hummed with that old primal cocktail of terror and anticipation. I snatched up my rifle and radio, already keying the mic to report contact. But then I hesitated, finger hovering over the talk button. If I called it in, I knew what would happen. The circus would come to town, SWAT teams, helicopters, media vultures. The forest would be crawling with trigger-happy cops and glory-seeking hunters, each wanting to bag the big bad wolf. And in the chaos, the creature would vanish like smoke, leaving more bodies in its wake. No, I had to handle this alone. End it cleanly and quietly before anyone else got hurt, before I lost my nerve. I shouldered my rifle and headed out into the icy night, following the phantom trail. The moon illuminated the snowscape in shades of silver and indigo as I ghosted from tree to tree, ears straining for any unnatural sound. But the forest had fallen preternaturally silent, even the usual owl hoots and coyote yips muted, as if the animals sensed an apex predator in their midst. An hour passed, then two, with no further sign of my prey. No tracks, no scat, no broken branches to betray its passage. It was as if it had been a mirage, a trick of moonlight and shadow. I began to doubt myself, wondering if months of isolation and obsession had shredded my sanity. I was on the verge of turning back, exhausted and disgusted with myself, when I stumbled into a small clearing and stopped dead. There, in the center of the open space, stood an old hunting cabin, little more than a shack. Its wooden walls were warped and rotting, the roof sagging beneath a mantle of snow, the windows black and vacant. It looked long abandoned, but leading up to the crooked door were unmistakable prints in the fresh powder, massive paw prints far too large to be a wolf or mountain lion, and they had already begun to fill with rime as if whatever made them had passed this way minutes before. My heart thundered against my ribs and my palms slicked on the rifle stock as I stared at that dilapidated cabin. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to radio for backup, to do anything but confront what might be lurking in that dark den. But in my mind's eye I saw the savaged bodies of the lost, the disappeared. I felt again the searing pain of monstrous claws shredding my flesh. Phantom tasted my own blood, and my resolve hardened to a diamond point. Slowly, silently, I approached the derelict door, rifle at the ready. Up close I could see gouges in the split logs, as if some huge beast had raked the wood in frustration or anticipation. Scratched into one of the planks, almost invisible beneath decades of grime, was a crude pictogram, 3 stick figures, and a bipedal dog wolf, its jaws yawning hungrily. My breath clouded the icy air, each exhalation a countdown to the point of no return. Gingerly, I stretched out my free hand to grasp the rusted knob. Then in one swift motion I kicked the door open and lunged inside, rifle leveled to fire. But the cabin was empty. No hulking man-beast waiting to pounce. No pile of splintered bones. Just a one-room hunting shack, thick with the smells of mildew, rat droppings, and wet dog, and a trapdoor set into the warped floorboards, ringed with massive claw marks, as if something had frantically scrabbled to open or close it. I stood frozen, eyes riveted on that innocuous square of wood. My mind raced, trying to gauge the odds that the creature was down there right now, listening to my rabbiting heart, preparing to spring out and end me. But I had come too far to back out now. Gun trained unwaveringly on the trapdoor, I inched forward across the creaking floor, then stamped my boot down hard on one corner of the square. The rotted wood crumbled beneath my heel, and the door flew open with a screech of rusted hinges, revealing a black maw. The fetid stench of decay belched out. Bile rising in my throat, I snatched a flashlight from my belt and aimed the beam down the ragged hole. Rough earthen walls, root tendrils swaying from the ceiling, an ancient wooden ladder leading down into the dark. And there, at the bottom of the pit, just at the edge of my circle of light, a huddled form. My finger tightened on the trigger. Every muscle coiled to fire. But as my beam landed on the shape and my eyes adjusted, I realized with a cold shock that it was human, or had been once. The desiccated remains curled in on themselves, little more than a skeleton clad in shreds of rough fur and rags. Humanoid, but wrong, somehow, the proportions subtly askew, and clutched in one bony, elongated hand, a crumbling leather-bound journal. I stared down into the abyss, my mind reeling. This couldn't be the creature I'd been hunting, could it? After all this time, was I too late? Or was this some older victim, dragged here to rot by the thing that had taken its place? Swallowing hard, I slung my rifle on my back and slowly lowered myself into the hole, feeling for each rung of the rickety ladder with my feet. The ancient wood creaked alarmingly under my weight, but held as I descended into the putrid dark. At the bottom of the pit, I knelt beside the withered corpse, the flashlight beam dancing over its grotesque form. Up close, I could see that the limbs were simply too long to be human. The skull malformed beneath papery skin, and the teeth that poked from the lipless mouth were just slightly too sharp, too numerous. Whatever it was, it had been dead a long, long time, but I couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that its empty sockets were somehow watching me, even in death, judging me. With a trembling hand, I pried the ancient journal from the thing's skeletal grip, unleashing a puff of dust. The pages crackled beneath my fingers as I opened the yellowed tome, dreading what forgotten secrets I might find within. The first pages of the journal were little more than fragments, the ink faded, and the parchment crumbling to the touch. But as I turned the brittle leaves with shaking hands, a story began to take shape in arcane, spidery script. A story that chilled me more than any blizzard. According to the increasingly feverish scrawls, the journal's owner had been a fur trapper named Elias Pike, an itinerant mountain man who'd roamed these woods over a century ago. As the railroads and boomtowns began to encroach on his territory, Elias retreated ever deeper into the untamed wilderness, clinging to the vestiges of a dying way of life. It was on one of his long, lonely sojourns that he first encountered the creature he came to call Old Ephraim, a beast that walked like a man but ran on all fours faster than any natural animal, that spoke in a twisted mockery of human language, its words burbling from a lupine throat. that possessed an uncanny, almost malevolent intelligence behind its yellow eyes. At first, Elias tried to kill the thing, seeing it as competition for the dwindling resources of the forest. But old Ephraim proved too cunning, too nimble to be caught by conventional means, and as Elias became more isolated, more unhinged, his obsession with the creature transmuted into something darker. He began to leave offerings for old Ephraim, haunches of venison, hunks of his own trapping takes. Then, when the gifts of flesh failed to satiate, he turned to loftier sacrifices. Elias scribbled of waylaying travelers, lone prospectors and pioneers, and leaving their eviscerated remains for his forest brother. The last coherent entry spoke of Elias's intention to become one with old Ephraim, to transcend his humanity and join the beast in its eternal hunting ground. There were ink blots that might have been tears or blood. The rest of the pages dissolved into a mad, spiraling scrawl, little more than the animalistic scratchings of a mind no longer tethered to reason or reality, and throughout a single glyph repeated over and over, almost carved into the parchment, the crude pictogram of the dog-headed man, its stick-figure jaws spread wide. I closed the tome with a shudder, feeling tainted by the touch of its pages. In my hubris, I had thought myself the hunter, nobly pursuing a monster to protect the innocent. But now I saw the truth, that I was little more than the latest fly stumbling into an ancient web, the most recent meal for a hunger that could never be sated. Old Ephraim the dogman, whatever name it went by, this thing was no mere creature of flesh and blood. It was something older, more primal, a manifestation of the wilderness itself, red in tooth and claw. The spirit of the untamed frontier, devouring the civilized world, bite by bite, and I had been marked as its next conquest. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. The journal clutched in my trembling fist was no record of one man's descent into madness. It was an instruction manual, a twisted gospel. Elias Pike had been the first acolyte, but he would not be the last. Somewhere above me, a floorboard creaked, the icy prickle of eyes on the back of my neck, and I knew with leaden certainty that I was no longer alone in the cabin. I turned slowly on my heel, heart hammering against my ribs, and there, at the edge of the flashlight's wavering beam, crouched the dogman. It was even more horrific in the flesh than in my nightmares. A towering, barrel-chested form, easily 7 feet tall, even hunched on its haunches. Matted fur cloaked its hide in a patchwork of grays and blacks, slick with an oily sheen. Elongated limbs ended in wickedly taloned paws, the claws jaundiced and cracked. But it was the head that arrested me, turned my knees to jelly. Not quite wolf, not quite human, but some blasphemous melding of the two. A protruding snout bristling with dagger teeth, a jaw that could crack bone like kindling, pointed ears laid back against a sloping skull, and those eyes, those terrible yellow eyes, alight with a feral, cunning intelligence that held me pinned like a moth in a killing jar. In that moment, I knew with sick certainty that this was a true predator, that I had never been the hunter at all, merely a mouse that thought itself the cat, and now it was time to pay the piper. The creature took a step forward, its black lips peeling back from its fangs in a hideous parody of a grin. A low coughing growl bubbled up from its barrel chest, resolving into guttural, half-formed words. "Found you," it burbled, its breath a miasma of carrion and musk. My turn, I scrabbled backward on my haunches, my back fetching up hard against the earthen wall of the pit. The rifle tangled at my hip, caught in my jacket. My fingers touched only the cool grip of my sidearm. Too little, too late. The dogman lunged, a blur of fur and fury, faster than anything that size should move. I barely had time to throw my arms up in a futile defense before it was on me, all hot breath and slashing claws. I cried out as a talon opened my cheek to the bone, a bright slash of pain. I fumbled the handgun from its holster, aimed wildly for center mass, and squeezed the trigger. The shot boomed like cannon fire in the close confines of the pit. Desperation and cordite, but the bullet only grazed the thing's shoulder in a puff of blood and fur, barely slowing its onslaught. The creature bellowed its rage and raked at me again, its impossible strength battering through my guard. I felt my parka shred, flesh splitting beneath. My spine met the rough earthen wall, my skull bouncing off stone, stars spangling my vision. The pistol flew from my grip, clattering into the dark. My fingers clawed at the creature's steaming bulk, finding no purchase on the slippery pelt. I could feel my strength ebbing with each hot pulse of blood from my wounds. So this was how it would end. Not in a blaze of heroic glory, but with a whimper in the dark. Anonymous as any other hiker picked off the trail. No blotter story, no folded flag, just one more name on a list that would never be published. A file stamped, case closed, and tossed in a dusty drawer. The dogman's jaws yawned above me, a cavern of tombstone teeth and abattoir stench. I stared into those pitiless yellow eyes and I saw recognition, satisfaction, triumph. This was a dance it had done 1,000 times before and would do 1,000 times again. The beast had already forgotten my name, but it would savor my screams long after my bones were picked clean. I threw back my head and shouted my defiance into that sepulchre maw, even as those gleaming fangs lunged for my throat. If I was going to die, it would be on my feet, fighting with my last breath. The forest would remember my final stand, but in that frozen moment between one heartbeat and the next, as those scythe-like teeth hovered a hair's breadth from my jugular, the impossible happened. The dogman jerked, its massive body spasming as if struck by lightning. A gargled whine escaped its throat and it slumped forward, pinning me beneath its leaden bulk. Shock and incomprehension held me paralyzed for a lung-burning time. Then, with a Herculean effort, I pushed the stinking carcass off me, gasping for breath. I stared down at the creature, half expecting it to rise again in a final paroxysm of violence, but it lay still, its yellow eyes already filming over in death. And there, protruding from the matted fur between its shoulders, the bright fletch of a crossbow bolt. What the hell? I croaked, my throat raw from screaming. Before I could process this deus ex machina, a scuffing on the ladder drew my eyes upward. There, silhouetted in the opening of the pit, was Tyler, the seasonal ranger I'd worked with all those months ago, the kid who'd saved my life and then vanished into academia. He was older now, gaunter, his baby face sharpened into hard planes, and clutched in his hands an enormous crossbow, already cocked with another bolt. I gaped up at him, my mouth working soundlessly. Tyler's eyes flicked from my ravaged form to the fallen monster, taking in the scene with the cool appraisal of a chess master surveying a finished game. "Looks like I got here just in time," he remarked with forced casualness. "You okay?" "Am I what? How?" I sputtered, levering myself painfully to my feet. 1,000 questions roiled in my mind, each more preposterous than the last. But one rose to the surface like a bloated corpse. "What are you doing here?" Tyler's mouth twisted in a wry approximation of a smile. He lowered himself into the pit with cat-like grace, keeping the crossbow trained on the felled dogman. "Same as you, I expect," he answered cryptically. "Hunting the hunter. Finishing the job." He nudged the creature's carcass with his toe, nodding with grim satisfaction. His gaze fell on the crumbling journal, still clutched in my bloodied fist. "Ah, I see you found Pike's diary," he remarked, as casually as if he'd caught me reading a dime novel. "Illuminating, isn't it? Amazing. The secrets that can fester out here in the wilderness." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of pain and adrenaline. I don't understand. What is this thing? Where did it come from?" Tyler shrugged, but his eyes stayed flat and flinty. "Who can say? Some rogue evolutionary offshoot, a freak of nature, or maybe something older, something other. The native tribes have legends of skinwalkers, of shape-shifting witches who take on the forms of beasts. And in Europe, the werewolf myths go back centuries." He smiled thinly. "But in the end, does it really matter? A predator is a predator, and it's the job of men like us to put them down, to protect the sheep from the wolves." His words hung in the fetid air of the pit, heavy with unspoken implications. I stared at him, a cold trickle of suspicion. I stared at Tyler, a cold trickle of suspicion worming down my spine. "Men like us?" I parroted numbly. "What are you saying? That you knew about this thing the whole time?" Tyler's smile sharpened. "Not the whole time, no. But I've been on its trail for a while now. Ever since that night it attacked you, and I got my first real glimpse of what we were dealing with. I knew then that I couldn't just walk away, that this was bigger than the both of us." He hefted the crossbow, his eyes distant and haunted. "I've seen things, man. Things I can't explain, that I can barely bring myself to believe. There are more monsters in these woods than just the one at your feet, and someone has to stand against them." I shook my head slowly, trying to process the implications. All this time I'd thought I was alone in my crusade, a lone knight tilting at windmills. But Tyler had been living the same nightmare, walking the same dark path. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked hoarsely. "We could have worked together, pooled our resources, maybe found this thing before it." I trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the shredded remains of the lost hikers, the scattered bones that littered the den. Tyler's face softened marginally. "I wanted to. God knows I could have used an ally, someone who understood, but I had to be sure you weren't compromised." "Compromised?" I bristled, indignation momentarily overcoming my shock. "You think it got to me? That I'm some kind of sellout?" "No, not like that," Tyler placated. "But this thing, it has a way of getting inside people's heads, of turning them to... its purpose, bit by bit, until they don't even realize they've become its servants, like Pike. He nudged the desiccated corpse with his boot. Why do you think the brass was so quick to write off the disappearances, to bury the evidence? It's not just about covering their asses. There are people in power, people we're supposed to trust, who know damn well what's out here, and they're content to let it keep feeding, as long as it doesn't get too greedy, as long as there's still plausible deniability. My mind reeled at the implications, the sheer scope of the conspiracy Tyler was suggesting. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was paranoid, unhinged. But hadn't I seen the signs myself? The unanswered questions, the gaping holes in the official story. What if I'd only scratched the surface of the rot? So what do we do now? I asked, my voice sounding small and lost to my own ears. Call it in, blow the whistle, go to the media? Tyler barked a harsh laugh. And tell them what? That we just killed Bigfoot's rabid cousin? That there's a secret cabal of monster huggers in the government? We'd be lucky if they just fired us. More likely we'd wind up in a padded room, or worse. He shook his head grimly. No, this is a war we have to fight in the shadows. One battle at a time, one beast at a time, until we root out every last bit of the infection. He held out his hand to me, his eyes boring into mine with feverish intensity. I can't do it alone. I need someone I can trust, someone who's seen the truth and is still standing. Are you in? I hesitated for a long moment, my gaze flicking between Tyler's outstretched hand and the nightmare sprawled at my feet. I thought of all the missing, all the lost, of the families who would never have closure, never know what had really happened to their loved ones, of the dark things that crept at the edges of the map, watching and waiting. And I knew in that moment that there was no going back, that the only way out was through. I reached out and clasped Tyler's hand in a bone-crushing grip, feeling the ragged edges of our palms slick with sweat and blood pressed together. It felt like a pact sealed in something more than ink. I'm in, I said simply, and the words tasted like gunmetal on my tongue. Epilogue. From which country or city do you follow the channel? The paperwork was a nightmare, of course. Even dead and cooling, the dogman's shadow loomed large over the brass. Tyler and I spent weeks mired in closed-door hearings, non-disclosure agreements, and pointed suggestions that we pursue early retirement or at least a transfer out of the field. But in the end, there was only so much they could do to bury the truth. Too many questions, too many loose ends. And maybe, just maybe, a few seeds of doubt had been planted. A few eyes opened to the cracks in the facade. Tyler and I kept our jobs, if only just. But we were no longer mere park rangers, cogs in the machine. We had a new mission, a higher calling. We became hunters, investigators, the thin green line between the wild places and the fragile illusion of civilization. We didn't always win. The monsters were legion, and more cunning than we could have imagined. Sometimes we were too late, arriving only in time to count the bodies and construct the cover stories. But we never stopped fighting, never gave up the hunt, because we knew now what lurked in the shadows of the forest. And we knew that someone had to stand against it, even if the cost was our sanity, our souls, even if no one else would ever know our names or the sacrifices we made. The Dogman was only the beginning, the first chapter in a war that would consume the rest of our lives. But as long as we drew breath, as long as we had each other's backs, the monsters would never sleep easy, and neither would we.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Unfortunately, the channel is going through a tough time right now, and we really need your help to keep creating content that you love. If you can, please share our videos with your friends and family, and leave a comment to let us know what you think. Every little bit helps and keeps us motivated to bring you more great content. Thanks again for being part of our community, and we hope to see you in the next video.